Hey everybody, Gary Simon here. So today we are tackling JavaScript and GreenSock. Now the GreenSock animation platform is a JavaScript-based library for creating awesome UI animations. They actually recently used it and integrated it into Webflow. Now this 3+ hour video right here is actually a part of my advanced front-end course at DesignCourse.com. So if you really enjoyed this and you watched for the 3 hours, then you can take the full course, which is over like 8.5 hours long. Now, what is GreenSock? Well, GreenSock Animation Platform essentially is a JavaScript animation library that allows you to integrate really cool animations in your UIs. Now, in this day and age of vibe coding, if you don't know how to speak the language of JavaScript and maybe GreenSock or anything like that, you're gonna have a hard time directing the LLMs to do what you want. So the first hour of this video is actually all about teaching basic JavaScript fundamentals. I assume you've never touched JavaScript. This is necessary information if you are a vibe coder and you're having a hard time getting the AIs to build what you want. Being able to speak its language is super important. So there are project files in the description of this video that you can follow along. Hopefully you enjoy it and I'll see you soon. Let's get started.
Alrighty, let us get started with the very first project. So here's what it is. If I refresh the browser, you'll see that we have a brief animation where things fade in and come down. And we can also hover over, and you can see there's a little bit of a micro interaction as it's called. If I zoom up, this give me another tip. You can see that we have an underline, a text decoration of underline being added on hover, and also we're moving over this little arrow as well, an SVG graphic. Then finally, if we click on it, all it does is simply change the text, or it manipulates the DOM, which is called the document object model. We'll get into that specifically here soon. As you can see, it's clearly a very, very simple project, but it is our very first project, and I'm making the assumption that you've never touched JavaScript before. Most courses, their very first project is literally a hello world console log. So even though this is simple, this is actually a little bit more so than what you would find in terms of complexity on most other courses. Because even just to get to this point, there's a fair bit of concepts to make all of this work, and we're going to tackle it for this specific project. Now in this video, this very first lesson, I want to tackle something that's very important, especially in regards to the type of course this is and our goal. Our goal is to create highly interactive websites or front ends. We're not interested in APIs or anything like that or connecting with databases, but one of the very important topics to understand is, should I use CSS to achieve this, or should I use JavaScript? So when we ask ourselves that question, we always want to try to use CSS as much as possible. If we can achieve it with CSS alone, then use CSS. Don't use JavaScript, all right? And there's a few things here in this particular project where we absolutely do not have to use JavaScript. So if I refresh this, we can see this initial animation coming in. Do we need to use JavaScript to do this? We could, but we don't have to. Also, what about this micro interaction here? If we hover over this and we change the styling, do we need JavaScript for that? No, we absolutely do not. Now, what about when we click on this and we change text up there? Yes, we want to use JavaScript for that. So in this video, we're going to work in the necessary CSS animations. And CSS animations can be broken up into two different methodologies. First would be a actual CSS animation with keyframes, and then also with transitions. So these are the two ways you can animate with CSS. And I'm going to show you both of those. So right now, our default, if you open up the project folder for this lesson, and you open up the pre-folder, you'll see that if we refresh it, there's no animation. There's no animation even when I hover over this. We want to get to that point here in this specific video. And then in the next lessons, we're going to start introducing JavaScript concepts. So even though this is a beginner JavaScript course, I definitely want to cover CSS as it pertains to animations, because these two are like hand in hand, all right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna go ahead and this is, first I'll just show you the rough HTML structure that we have working with, or that we have here. We have just a div class container that's containing everything, as you can see. Nested inside of that is an H1 element and then the button. Nested inside of the button is give me another tip, which is the text to the left of it. And then we have this SVG graphic, which is the arrow. Now, we have linked up here a style sheet of css/main.css. And if we look up here, we'll see that we have a CSS folder and we'll have our main.sass file. So we're using Sass here for this. And that just, the only reason we're using it is just for the nesting abilities. So we can nest things into each other like I'm using here. So if you click on main.sass, we'll see that we have just a few rule sets. We have an empty container rule set. We have just basic background here, H1 element, before, button, etc., etc. There's no animations or transitions occurring here. So if our goal is to make everything kind of fade in and move down, we're going to apply it on this div class container because we want all the elements to just come in and fade down. All right, so to do that, we're going to first set the opacity to 0. We're going to set the transform property, and transform property will allow you to do a bunch of different things, and sometimes several things simultaneously. You can scale things, like make them shrink them up and make them bigger. You can move things around with the translate property, either on the X or Y axis or both. And also you can rotate things. So we're just going to move things down, which means we're going to use translate Y because we're working on the up and down axis. So that's going to be translate Y, and then we're going to put in -50 pixels. So we're setting the original position up 50 pixels by default. All right. Then we're going to go ahead and specify an animation. Fade in for 1 second. So the animation name, we can name it whatever. I'm using camel case here. And then we're going to give it a duration of 1 second. And we also want to put in forwards. If we don't put in forwards, it'll end up kind of not repeating, but it'll just go back to the original state after the animation is complete. So I would advise removing this and just giving it a shot to see what happens. In fact, we're just going to do that anyhow. We could also add in specific animation properties, shorthand properties, or not shorthand properties, but specific properties for like controlling the delay as well. So we could put 0.5 seconds, and that way when a person refreshes the browser, there's a very slight delay and then things will come in. So now we have to go ahead and define this keyframe animation. And for that keyframe animation, here's how we do that. At keyframes, the name of it is fade in. And then for this one, all we have to say is 2. And then we'll put opacity 1. Because remember, we set it opacity 0 right here. And then we're going to say transform, translate Y back to 0, which is the original point of where this HTML element will be in the document. All right, so we're going to save that. And by the way, make sure you're watching this. I already covered this in the intro videos. You're watching the Sass file to make sure that your changes are being made. So I'm going to go ahead here and watch how it comes in and then it hides. Well, that's why we want to add forwards to the end of that animation property. So forwards, just like that, will come back. And now it will stay there. And that's what we want. So now let's go ahead and focus on this little micro interaction. Give me another tip. We have 2 things happening here. We want the text underline to show up on the hover, and then we want to move over that little arrow. So let's take it first with the text decoration. So when it comes to Sass, we're able to find that element. Let's see where it would be under button. And that button, that type, if we look back here, is right here, span. So button span, there it is. So we want to come inside of this rule set, and we're going to put the ampersand and then a colon, hover. So on hover, we just want to add text decoration, underline. Save it. We'll go back, and there we go. We have our nifty little underline. Very simple. Now this one, it's a little bit more complex. We have to move it over a few pixels based on whenever a person hovers over the entire button. All right, so if we go and find our button, we can come down here. We can say, and hover. So this means whenever the entire button's being hovered over, what is the next selector that we want to change something about? Well, you can see here we have the SVG element. So we want to move that SVG element, or the arrow, over a little bit. So we say SVG. And then we create a rule set for that specifically. And then all we say is transform. Remember, when you want to move something, is it on the y-axis, or are we going to move it on the x-axis? Well, in this case, we want to move it on the x-axis because the arrow is pointing that way. So it would make sense to do that. So we're going to say translate x this time instead of y. And we're just going to move it over very subtly to 10 pixels. So now we're going to go ahead and go back. If I hover over this, look at that. Very nice interaction. So when it comes to creating these highly interactive, amazing, beautifully designed websites, these tiny little micro interactions and paying attention to the small details really goes a long way. All right, so now at this point, we have what we want. We can refresh this, and we have our little micro interaction, but now nothing happens on click, and that's where we're going to focus on the next lesson. All right, so welcome to lesson 2 of our first project. If I refresh, it's not working because I forgot to open with live server. Let's go do that real quickly. There we go. It comes in. We have a little micro interaction down here, but we click it and nothing happens. We want to change this. Okay, so in this video, we're going to take a look at JavaScript, and specifically, we're going to look at variables and the 2 different types of variables, such as let and constant, and also the document object model. So there's a lot to digest here, and even though you're at the very beginnings of understanding JavaScript, understanding this stuff is extremely important. It's the foundation that you're going to be building upon. So pay attention, try to understand as much as possible. I'll do my best job to try to convey this information as much as possible. So I want you to follow along with me. I want you to open the live server extension like I discussed in the intro chapter about how to do all this stuff. And I want you to hit F12. This works with Firefox or Chrome. And when you do this, just ignore this little warning. If you see that, we're gonna come up here and we want to click on console right here. Now, sometimes depending on your browser settings, this might be opened up in a different area of your browser. It might be at the bottom. If you click on this little 3 dots, you'll see it gives you the option of where to place this. I have mine on the right side. So this is real important. If I click on elements up here, the elements tab, we'll see this, this representation of our HTML. Now, you may or may not know about this already, but in case you don't, I just wanted to be certain that you understand what's happening here. If we open up these elements, you can see it's highlighting based on where we're clicking on. Our goal is to change this text right here. It is absolutely necessary to keep improving. We can actually change it right here by double-clicking into it. I'll say, hi, what is up? It actually changes that for us. But when we make the changes in the browser, in the inspector, as this is called, and we refresh, it doesn't persist. It just stays there. It's only for the purpose of debugging things, for essentially. If we want this to persist and we want this to be able if we really want to truly be able to change this with JavaScript, then we need to obviously use JavaScript. And so I want you to think of this area as your kind of like your document object model, or your DOM. You'll hear this often, the DOM. It's an acronym that stands for Document Object Model. And we use JavaScript to interact with that in order to do things with it, like, for instance, change the inner text between these H1 elements. So I want to show you exactly how to do that. All right. So first, where do we write our JavaScript? Well, we have basically 2 different options. Especially when we're talking about a vanilla JavaScript project or just a pure JavaScript. We're not using libraries like React or Angular or Vue or Svelte. We can do it either in a separate file, which makes sense in pretty much all real projects. Or you could do it inline here within a script tag. So you just type in script, and by the way, this is called Emmet abbreviations. I could sit here and type all this HTML here by hand, like this little less than sign script, and then do all that. It'll autofill some of it, but if I know the tag name right off the bat, just type it, script, enter, and it's going to place the cursor where we want it to, and it'll also just negate us having to type a bunch of stuff. I have a very brief Emmet abbreviations course on my YouTube channel at DesignCourse. So you can just do a channel search and you can find that, because it allows you to do a bunch of other really cool stuff. All right, so we can write all of our JavaScript right here just before the closing body tag right there. All right, so what if we wanted to use JavaScript to change this type immediately on page load? All right, so right now it says it's absolutely necessary to keep improving. Well, I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and I'm just going to say hi. All right, so right now it just says hi. It looks ridiculous, right? So we're just going to leave that there temporarily. Now, if we want to change that JavaScript, we have to introduce a few concepts, especially if you're brand spanking new to JavaScript. Okay, so the first is what's called document. If I do what's also called a console.log, the log method, you're going to see methods all over the place. You'll see a little period and then a name. That right there is a method, okay? And then we're going to open this up in parentheses in order for it to accept an argument. And in our case, we want to pass in, and by the way, we could just say, I might as well just do hello world. This is one of the things that all JavaScript courses have. If I hit F12 to get out the inspector, and we go to console, you'll see it right there, hello world. Okay, now we don't want to console log that. We want to console log something called document. All right, we're going to save this, go back, and you'll see it has this little right arrow. We can click this, and it's basically a representation of our entire HTML. Isn't that interesting? All right, ignore this script part, but we have our H1. All right, we can see it says hi. How do we change this though? The H1 element, we need to get access to that specifically. So to do that, let's go ahead, and you can make a comment, by the way, with just 2 forward slashes. Notice in Visual Studio Code, it will just gray it out. That means this code's not going to run, but it's there for us just to make comments or comment out code. And that's very handy for debugging, and it's also very handy for just documenting what certain things of your JavaScript does. So what we want to do is say document.querySelector. Now what is that? What is this dot thing and then a name after it? That's a method, okay? Query selector is something that you find yourself using a lot for interactive front ends, okay? Or creating interactive websites, essentially. Query selector basically takes a parameter, and that parameter is going to be an HTML element, all right? Or sometimes you refer to as an HTML tag. Div is a tag. H1 is a tag, button is a tag, span, SVG, there are many of them. We have a few of them here. We want to specify H1 because that's something that we want to change. We want to change the inner text, this hi, to something else. So to do that, we just pass in with quotes or just single quotes, H1, all right? Now, if you uncomment the line above it and we just paste that in and we save this, you're going to see in our code inspector we have H1 and has all these properties about it. Look at all these different things here that it's providing us information about. Well, if we look here specifically, right there at inner text, it says hi. Well, we can tie into that. And what we can say, and let's go ahead and comment this out, is dot inner text equals, and then we put in quotes. And then for us, we're going to give it the original. It is absolutely necessary to keep improving. Now, by the way you end a line you can either use a semicolon in JavaScript, or you can just choose not to include it. All right, that's a very important concept. Me, I'm just going to choose not to write it with a semicolon. So if I save it, I come back, notice there it is. Even though in our HTML it says hi, our JavaScript has now overwritten that because we're manually setting, we're changing the DOM to it is absolutely necessary to keep improving. And that's why it shows up and you don't even see hi. Hi might be there for an extremely split second in the context of this project because the JavaScript will render thereafter. But we don't see it because we're setting this to opacity 0. So that's why by default we just don't see it. Okay. Now this is one way of changing the DOM, so to speak. But typically you want to use variables. JavaScript variables are one of the most simple foundational concepts to understand. And remember, I talked about the JavaScript variables of types being let versus constants. I'm not sure if I talked about that yet, but I'm going to talk about it now. We're going to refactor this, and refactor means just to change the code. All right, I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. Now down here, we're going to define our very first JavaScript variable, which is exciting stuff to me. So our very first JavaScript variable, the way you define a JavaScript variable, modern JavaScript is going to be one of two ways. You're going to use a let variable or you're going to use a constant variable. Sounds strange, sounds maybe complex. It's not, it's so simple. All right, you use let when you know that this variable might change in the future. The assignment might change in the future in your JavaScript. Otherwise, use constant when you know that it's never going to change. You don't want it to change. You're not going to be changing the value. You're not going to be reassigning it. That's it. That's all it means. And why do you want to use constant in that case? Because it just helps for code readability. When you see a const variable, you know, okay, this cannot change. And if you try to change it, it will error, and we'll see how that works. So we're going to use a const, and we just type in const. That's all it is. C-O-N-S-T, and then the name. All right, the name of the variable. So const. All right, well, we're just going to say quote because it says give me a new quote, and that's what we're going to use. And we say equal, and then this is where we specify this type right here. All right, very simple. Now at this point, if we save it, nothing's going to happen in the browser. It's just going to go back to hi because we commented out this line. It doesn't run anymore, even though we see it. And there's still no interactivity. So really, we've just created a variable, but it just exists in memory. We're not doing anything to make it show up. All right. Now we can also create a variable. And by the way, we can console log quote just like that. We can save this. We can come back, and we can now see it is right there in our console. So now what we want to do is we want to assign this variable here to this section. So what we can do, we'll delete that. We can just say equals quote. All right, so let's save that, and guess what? It's going to work exactly the same way as before, except this time we're taking this string and we're assigning it to this quote variable, and then we're taking quote and we're passing it into here. It's the same thing, except we've just used 2 lines now instead of 1. Now we can even take this a step further, but before I do that, I want to introduce something that's very important. Like I said, the difference between let and const. This is a constant right here. Quote is a constant variable. So if I try to reassign it to quote equals hello world, we're going to save it. Uh-oh, look what we have. Uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. We're trying to reassign a constant variable. That will not work, all right? So if we wanted to do that, we change it to a let. So we can save it there. Guess what? It showed up. There's no more errors. It says hello world. Very important concepts. I know this is very simple, but I want to make sure you absolutely understand this concept because this can really start to trip you up when the projects become more complex. All right, so let's go back to const and let's delete that. And we could take this a step further. All right, so if I also take both of these lines of type and I hit Control / it will comment both of those out. Now, you can also comment in another way. If I add a / and a asterisk and then end it here with an asterisk, that's a quick way of commenting out multiple lines without having to add double / in front of them. Very important to understand that as well. So let's just go ahead and take this. We're going to start from here again. And this time, we're also going to create a constant that references this element right here, our h1 element. All right, so I'm going to copy that. All right, so const title equals, and again, we'll take this here, make sure we have that copied, paste it in. And now all we have to do is say title.innerText equals quote. All right, so we've defined our properties up here, our variables, and then we do something with them right here. And notice how this is much more simplistic looking than something like this, which is very long. And this is typically how you're going to do things in the future. Even though this is just one line, this is a lot more readable, especially when you start having a bunch of properties and variables. It just works better this way. So if we save, we go back, we'll see that even though it says hi right here, it is still working just as it did in this first top line, except we're just making the code a little bit more readable. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and now focus on how we can actually tie in and add what's called an event listener on this give me another tip button so that we can then change it only once this is clicked here. All right, welcome to lesson 3 of our first project. And what I have here is a web result. I went to Google and I typed in add event listeners list, and I found this reference right here. And we're going to be attaching an event listener to that little button element. And when it's clicked, then we're going to make it execute some sort of code that will change that quote, which we've already done. And there are many different types of event listeners. There is the one that we want, which is click. So an element is clicked on. Well, there are many others as well. You can see blur, can play. The ones that you end up using the most are mouse events, like hovering over things, like mouse over. You can see key press. There are so many, like mouse out. So when the mouse leaves an element, then we can make something happen through JavaScript. When the mouse enters, when the mouse clicks down, there are so many. There's a mouse wheel. We can use the wheel event that is deprecated, which means it's no longer supported. Just use a wheel event if you want something to happen when somebody uses their mouse wheel. There are so many here to use. You don't have to memorize all of them. In fact, you don't use most of them in most projects. You only use a tiny amount. Click is one that's used probably the most out of them all. There's also the mouse over, mouse out, etc., etc. I just wanted you to be aware of that. So let's go ahead and write our own. Okay, so looking at our HTML, by the way, I want to make sure I am live here with live server. And I also want to make sure in my CSS that I'm watching the Sass, although we won't be changing any of the CSS anyhow. And here we go. Okay, so what we want to happen, just to refresh this, when this button element is clicked, we want code to initiate that will change this to whatever we want. All right, so if we go back to our HTML, we look at the HTML structure, we can see we have the button. The button is the element in the DOM that we want to attach an event listener to. So we already know how to gain access to these DOM elements. All right, so it should just be a simple matter of creating a variable that references our button element, and then we're going to use a new method to attach to it called add event listener of a type of click. Here's how we do it. Well, we're going to, let me just zoom up here. Right here, we're going to specify, we already have our quote, we already have the title, and we want to take this out. Let's remove this one. What we're going to specify is we're going to have a button. Oh, we first have to actually get the button. So let's do const button equals document.query selector button. All right, very simple. So now we have 3 different constant variables. Now what we're going to say is button.add event listener. Now, by the way, when you're typing some of these methods out, you'll see this little thing right here. You can just hit enter and that will automatically fill it for you, so you don't have to keep typing. Now, the first parameter is the type. Remember those types that we saw, like mouse out, mouse over, scroll, wheel, etc., etc.? This is where we wrap it inside of, I use single quotes. You could use double quotes if you want. And I'm going to put in click. That's the type of event listener. Then the next parameter is the function or the code that you write this in. So for us, we're going to use what's called an arrow function. So we put equal and then greater than, and then before we do that, we put parentheses. So it kind of looks a little strange right here. This is for passing in other data. We don't need it. So we just put this plus this, and then we put the squiggly little braces here and hit enter. That's typically what this looks like. It looks very strange and confusing. Don't worry about that. Then right down here, we have the closing, the two closing tags right here. So inside of here, this is where we're going to execute the code. So what this means, logically speaking, when this button is clicked, execute this code inside here. Well, we already have the code because we've done it over here already. We have our quote, we have our title. So what we want to do is simply say title.innerText, remember we used that method already, equals quote. Now let's save this. It says, hi, give me another tip. There we go. It is absolutely necessary to keep improving. Now let's go ahead and change this real quick. I'm going to go back up here, change hi to that, and then I'm going to paste in a new quote off screen to right here. Let's save it again. All right, let's refresh. We'll see the animation come in. We have a micro interaction. We click it, and there you go. Because if you do not, you will remain stagnant. So that right there, in a nutshell, is a very simple example of a lot of what you end up doing when you're making these interactive sites. All right, so now let's go ahead and take this a little bit further here, and I want to demonstrate another concept that will be really important for us to understand. All right, so remember how we have const title right here. Remember, constants variables cannot be reassigned. So if we want to change quote here inside of this function, we can say quote equals some other text. And of course, if we save this, we click it, we get that error again, assignment to constant variable. So I can't drive this point home enough. It's very important to understand if you want to do something like that, we say let, not a constant. So now we save it and it works. Another final thing I wanted to introduce, and this is also extremely important, is the concept of taking this code here and putting it into its own function. So we haven't talked about functions yet, but this is something that you'll end up using because it allows you to reuse your code so that you're not verbose, or in other words, repeating lines of code all the time. So this is an extremely simple example of this, but we're going to make a function out of this right here. So we're going to take this code, we're going to delete it, and we're going to say function change quote, and notice this is called camel case. The first letter of the function name is lowercase, and then any other words thereafter, the first letter will be capitalized. So in change quote, after creating a function out of that, we wrap it, put it in parentheses at the end. It's a little strange because they're empty and there's nothing in it, and that's because in the future we can pass in parameters and arguments in there, but we don't need that right now. And so then we put in our squiggly braces, and then we put in the code inside of that. Then right here, we can take this and refactor it. So let's go ahead and, well, yeah, let's just go ahead and change this up. All we have to do is pass in the name of the function, change quote. And this time we don't put parentheses after it. All right, very important to understand that. And now if we save it, guess what? It is going to work. All right, works just the same. All right. So hopefully you're starting to understand how this works at this point. That very first project, even though it was extremely simple, is now complete. And of course, we can make this way more complex, and we are going to work our way up and up while learning new JavaScript concepts, while also making more interesting projects going forward. Okay, here is our second project, and it is a dark/light mode toggle. So if I come over here and I click on this, we're going to see it changes the background to white and the text to dark or black. And then if we click it again, it reverts back. And you can see there's a slight transition. It's not an immediate one. We'll handle that with CSS. And we could also see that this little handle, this little circle here, moves over. It transforms on the x-axis. So in order to get to this point, we have to introduce several new JavaScript concepts. Now, before we get into that, I do want to mention that you can actually do this sort of thing without JavaScript and with the use of checkboxes, but you could also do it with JavaScript as well. And I really wanted to use this very simple project as a means to describe some very important JavaScript concepts. Okay, so make sure you open up the appropriate folder for the toggle button here on lesson 1 in the before or the pre folder. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the HTML. So for our HTML, it's pretty straightforward. We have a div class container just wrapping around everything. We have a label of dark. We also have a label of light, and then in the middle we have a div class of switch with a class of handle, which is the circular element. So very simple, straightforward HTML. In terms of our CSS, very simple. We are utilizing CSS variables or CSS custom properties right here. We can see we only have 2. So background color is by default. So by default, we're starting this app off with a dark mode. All right, so we're setting it to this nearly black color, and then we're setting the text color to white. So then in the body, we're specifying that background color and the text color. And we're also, as you can see, transitioning the background color so that once the background color changes, it'll give it a animation from that dark black, almost black color to the white color. You could make that immediate. You don't have to put a transition there, but it's just something we're choosing to do. We also have our container, just making it a flex so that we have our 3 columns. We have the label, we have the toggle switch in the middle, and then we have the other label. And then we're just styling up the switch itself, nothing fancy happening here. There is something down here which is currently not being used in the project, and that is a rule set called move right. And you can see it's a transform translate x 45 pixels. And we're going to be utilizing, and we haven't done this yet, it's a new concept. We're going to be utilizing JavaScript to attach this class, the CSS class, onto that little handle element once it's clicked. And that will initiate this code right here, this CSS property, to move it over. All right, so that when it comes to these interactive websites and these highly interactive front ends, a very common pattern that you will see is we use JavaScript to attach a CSS class to a given element or multiple elements depending on the use case. All right, so now what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and get started with our JavaScript here at the bottom just before the closing body tag. And we are going to create a few different variables. One is going to be a constant, another is going to be a constant, and then we're also going to introduce a let variable, but it's also going to be a Boolean value, and we'll get to that in a second. But for now, let's go ahead and define these variables. So first, ask yourself, what is it that needs to happen in terms of JavaScript interactivity? And from there, what are the variables that need to be defined? Well, if we go back to our project, it's this click. Everything is predicated on getting this click to do something. So in order to do that, what are we clicking on? Well, I can show you in our dev inspector. We just click this little blue icon right up there, and then allow us to select this entire element. And it shows us it's the div class of switch. And it also has an ID of switch. All right, so at this point in time, this is actually not the live project we're working on. I have the finished project on the actual different monitor. If you look at yours, it doesn't function yet. And also, if I get out F12 and we grab this same thing, we'll see that our div class switch doesn't yet have an ID. The handle doesn't have an ID. The reason we want an ID is because of this. I'm going to show you. Up until this point, we've been using query selector in order to access certain DOM elements. So we can say const switch. By the way, if you hit switch, if you just use the name switch, you'll see like this red underline. The reason it is because if you hover over it, switch is not allowed as a variable declaration name. So in JavaScript, there are certain names that you cannot use. So we can just use switch camel case btn. All right. So if we tried to do document.query selector and just select the div element for our switch, and notice there's multiple div elements. There's one here, here, here. There's 3 of them. And I just put div here. This will not work. So query selector is just only for selecting a single element typically. If you wanted to select multiple elements, we would use query selector all in a form of an array, but we're going to get to that later on. If we just want to be able to choose one of these elements, one of the div elements, we can do it by adding an ID attribute, and we'll give it the name of switch. So ID equals switch. Go ahead and add that. And the way we do this is we say document dot, and the method that we're going to use this time is not query selector, is going to be get element by ID. And that ID name we've specified up there, switch. All right, there we go. Now we're going to replicate that line. Shift Alt and the down arrow key will allow you to replicate that current line. And we're going to create another one. We also have to get the handle because we want to attach this CSS class move right to that handle. So to do that, we're going to give this a unique name. We'll call it handle. Get element by ID, handle. And we of course have to add the ID here, handle. And it's okay if the class and the ID are the same name. Okay, now that we have that, we're going to define a third variable, and we need a way to know which state the app is currently in. Is it currently in dark mode or is it currently in light mode? Well, we're going to do that by storing a variable, and we can do this in multiple ways, and we will. But the first way we're going to do it is just we're going to set the actual variable to either a 0 or a 1. So we're going to say let switch status equals 0. We're going to add a comment here. 0 is dark, 1 is light. All right. Now you're going to find we'll be able to do this same concept, except we'll use a Boolean value, which means true or false. And we're going to do that there at the end. Now finally, now that we have all the necessary variables created, what needs to happen next? Well, the click. We have access to the button, which is the switch right here. That's this code. We can say switch btn.add event listener. It's a click. And then we can go ahead and pass in a function. We'll just call this toggle mode. And again, you could write it like this and just put the code in here, or just go back to what we were doing like this, and then say function toggle mode and open it up like that. All right, so at this point, we can console log just to make sure it works. We can come back to our project. We'll click it, go back to console, and it says hello. And it will keep on saying hello no matter how many times you click it. All right, so at this point is going to be a good part to stop this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and introduce another very crucial concept in JavaScript, and that is our if statements. All right, here's our project. We click it, nothing happens yet, and that is okay. Let's go ahead and now introduce a brand new concept, and that is an if statement, if else. Now, what we can do is we can write an if statement like this. What we want to check is the switch status state. Is it 0 or is it 1? That's going to help us determine which classes we need to be adding or removing. And it also helps us determine when we try to overwrite these variables right here, what colors they should be set at. All right, so here's how we do that. We simply say if, we wrap it in parentheses, and what is it that we want to compare? Well, we want to compare the switch status. If switch status, and this is called a comparison operator, equals, equals, equals. I'm going to say right here, in this case, 1. And then we're going to open this up in the squiggly braces right here. So let me show you real quickly. This is JavaScript comparison operators. There's a bunch of them. As we can see, we have equal to, just for double equal signs. We have the one that we just used, equal value and equal type. Putting exclamation point equal is not equal, and then the same kind of parallel here to not equal to value or not equal to type. We have greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than and equal to, or a ternary operator, which actually is kind of like a very quick way of writing an if-else statement, and we'll get to that as well in the future. But just understand that even though these are confusing right now, we're going to be working with these more so going forward in the context of our different projects. All right, so we're basically saying if switch status is absolutely equal to the value of 1, then do something inside of here. All right, so if that's the case, remember 1 is light, then we want to go ahead and I guess we want to do two different things really. We want to update the value of these CSS properties, which we can do through JavaScript. And we also want to move that little circular element over to the right. And we're going to do that by attaching this class right here. Okay, so the first thing that we'll do is let's set those properties in CSS right here. So you're probably wondering, how do we access these CSS property values or the CSS properties and be able to update their values through JavaScript? All right, so for this, we're just gonna have to memorize a little bit of code for this sort of thing. So first we specify document, just like we did previously. And then we're gonna say document element dot style. This gives us access to all the styles, so you could console log this alone right now just to see what comes back. And then we're going to say set property, and then the first parameter accepts the actual name of the CSS property that we defined. So we have the background color, and let me hit Control B to get rid of the sidebar for a second. And the second parameter accepts the new value that we want to set it to. So the background color, we're going to make that white. Now we're going to Shift Alt and down because we want this to overwrite two different properties. And for this one, it's going to be text color. This text color will be black. White on black, we're going to have maximum contrast. All right. So let's go ahead and save this as is and see what happens. So we'll go back, We'll click it. Uh-oh, it is not working. So let's figure out why that's not working. Well, if you think about it, let's switch status equals 0. Well, this isn't running. This code is not initiating because we wrapped it in an if statement that says if is equal to 1. All right, so if I remove this, the if statement, and save it, we could see it now works, but it doesn't toggle back because we're not doing an if-else statement. All right, so maybe what we can do instead is change this to 0. All right, we'll come back. Ah, there we go. But if we click it again, it's not going to revert back. We don't yet have an else statement. So at the very end, we put else. So we're going to switch the switch status on this else statement here because we're changing the state of it to a light mode. So down here at the bottom, we can say switch status equals 1. And then we'll copy this. Else switch status equals 0. Then we'll take these two right here, we'll paste them, and we just want to revert back to the original values right here. So this is going to be hashtag 232323 for the background color, and then the text color is white. Now if we save this, it's now going to toggle. Very, very simple. Now, of course, our little button is not, our handle is not moving over to the right and not moving back and forth. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and discuss exactly how to achieve that. All right, so let's go ahead and get that little handle moving over. There's one more line of code that we have to add in this first if statement and also the else statement. And so what we want to do is we want to attach this move right class to this element right here. Let me zoom up. This element right here to the handle. All right. So how would we do that? Well, we currently have a constant called handle, and we're getting that by its ID. And the way we do this with JavaScript is we're going to say handle dot class list dot add. All right. So we're essentially adding a class, and that class name is move-right. Now notice we don't put the little period like we do in CSS to define the rule set. We just do the class name only. Again, this will have the little dot for class, but we don't include that for class list.add. Then what we do is class list over here, we can say simply remove. And because we have, if you come up here, on the handle rule set transition transform, it's going to make that a smooth transition whenever this move right class gets added to the DOM and whenever it gets removed. So it'll have a nice animation between those two states. So let me make sure I am actually watching this project, which I wasn't. There we go. We click it, look at that. Now, if we didn't have that CSS transition property, if I remove that, watch what will happen instead. Oh, the reason that didn't work, this is a common issue, because we're using Sass here. We want to make sure we're watching that file. There we go. And of course, you'll need the live Sass compiler and extensions to do that. But notice how it's instant. And that's because we're utilizing transition. So now we can see that it's nice and smooth. Now I wanted to show you one final thing, another very important JavaScript concept here, and that is Boolean values. All right, so a Boolean value is either true or false. It's just to represent two different states. So what we can do is we can comment that out. We're going to redefine it as let's switch status equals false. All right, so now it is a false, either a Boolean value. It's either going to be true or false. And the way we can refactor this is we can say if it's this right here is currently saying if this is 0. Or in other words, we can say if exclamation point switch status. That means if it's false. That's a quick way of writing it. It's the same thing as just doing if switch status equals false. This is a faster way of doing that. Now, if you were to remove that, it simply means if it's true. So this exclamation point will help you determine when you have Boolean values if it's true or false. Very simple. All right, so then we have to update this. So this is 1 and 1 was light. We want to switch it to light mode, we say true. Then over here, we can say false. Now just to keep things a little bit more readable and consistent, because it's the last line of this if statement above it, we'll put it the last line here as well. Switch status is false. So that's how it creates this true or false action, this toggle essentially. So now what we can do is just hit save, now that it's been refactored. Click on it, and it works just the same. So one way isn't necessarily superior to the other, but just know that you have options. All right. Awesome stuff. This particular project is now done, and we've got a lot more to learn. So let's keep on going on. So we got a lot more to learn, so let's keep on going. All right, let's take a look at what we're going to build in this lesson. And it's actually pretty simple. We're only going to introduce one new concept, but we're going to reuse some of the other concepts just so we can really hammer home the ideas that you're learning in terms of JavaScript. So if I refresh this, you're going to see this loading animation, and then the page is going to push up, and it's going to reveal whatever's behind it. And in a real-world context, it would just be typically a full website user interface. And this splash screen right here, sometimes called like a preloader screen, it's there for the purpose of preloading assets. You might see something like this on big sites like awards.com, where you have, projects that have a lot of media that needs to be preloaded. And so we're going to be kind of faking this through what's called JavaScript set timeout, that little delay before it pushes up. And we're going to reuse a lot of the other concepts in terms of, for instance, making this move up and then also fading this in right here with JavaScript essentially. So let's go over here and take a look at the actual project. This is what I have so far. Let me scale things up here. And we can see what's happening here. We actually don't need this right there, that font stuff. All we have, if we look up here a little bit close, we have a div class of splash. That's the purple background. And then inside of it, we have this loader right here, which is pointing to loader.svg. Now, loader.svg I actually got from this resource right here. This is a really cool website. It's just called samherbert.net/svg-loaders right up here. And if I go back, let's see, you can basically click download, and you can download a folder from GitHub and access all of these. So they're just nice animated SVG based loaders. We're using this one right here, as you can see. So what we want to do is we can see also we have the section element, and this is typically where you'd have your website UI. So this div splash element is position absolute, and it's just positioned on top of the website background. And then we just move it up out of the way with transform translate y negative 100%. So just to take a look at the CSS, we have just a few things happening here. We have the body, we have the splash. Again, position is absolute, top and left is 0, width is 100%, height is 100 viewport heights. We have a display grid, place content center, that puts that little icon, the SVG icon in the middle. And then we put the background color right there. And then the image or the SVG width is just at 90 pixels. And yeah, everything else here is pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and hop in and get writing with the JavaScript right here. So think about things sequentially. The first thing that we want to happen is we want to have that screen showing the loading graphic. All right, so if we go back, this is what we currently have. Nothing happens. It's just going to keep on looping this animation because we have no JavaScript to tell it to do anything otherwise. So typically, and we're going to do this in the full course for the Java Advanced Front Ends JavaScript course, you would have like an image or an asset loading library, a JavaScript library, and we're going to be doing that, but not for this. We're just going to kind of like hack it in such a way where instead of waiting for it to load assets, we're just going to use, like I said at the beginning of this video, set timeout. And that is basically a function that allows us to make things happen based on a predefined delay. All right, so we can just delay things inside of a function essentially. So here's how we're going to first do this. The first thing that we need access to is going to be this element right here, the splash element. Why? Because we want to be able to target that to add a class to it that will push it up and out of the way. So we're going to use const, and we're going to say splash equals document.query selector. And we're just going to specify splash right there. Next up, we also, when we're defining all of our variables, I want to define them pretty much all in one location at the top here. So we also have to get access to our h1 element because we want this element to fade in and fade down, which means we also want to attach a class to it through JavaScript. So all I have to do is just Shift Alt down to replicate that. And then this time we're going to change this query selector parameter to simply h1. And we'll just call this headline. All right, and that should be pretty good right there. All right, so let's use set timeout for this first time. So to use set timeout here, we're just going to say set timeout, camel case there, and we are going to open it up in parentheses, and then here in the first argument, we're going to put another parentheses, but it's going to be empty, and we're going to use an arrow function to open it up here. Now, it takes a second parameter over here where we put it in a comma, and this is the time in terms of sorry, milliseconds. So how long before all of this code that happens in here will execute essentially? You know, how long should it wait essentially? It's kind of like a delay. So if I put in 2000 milliseconds, or in other words, 2 seconds, then if I do a console log in here, we'll just say hi. I save this and go back, and let's hit F12. You'll see it says hi right here, but I didn't give myself enough time. So if I just hit F12 again, there we go. Sorry, it was not showing up here initially. If I just refresh this over here, you'll see 1, 2, and there it shows up. 1, 2, and it shows up. Okay, so that's the idea behind set timeout. Very handy. You'll see it has many different use cases. So what we can do is we can then go ahead and say something like this: splash dot, here, let me zoom up, class list dot add. And again, we've done this already. Let's add a class, a CSS class called remove-splash. All right, now what'll happen is if we come back here and we look in the elements section, and then we look right here where it says remove splash. So if I refresh this, you're going to see it gets added to this splash class that we specified. Now, of course, remove splash doesn't yet exist in our CSS. So we want to add that. We'll add it right here. And so what that's going to look like is very simple. We're just going to say remove-splash transform translate y -100%. Now let's go ahead and save this and see what happens. Refresh 1, 2, and it's hidden immediately. We want that to transition out or animate out. And the way we do this is on the splash element itself. We can just say transition transform 1 second. And then we can use an easing function, cubic Bezier. So I think I'll use this second one down here. Now we save that, we go back, refresh, and there we go. Fades out. All right, awesome. The next step is to get this to fade in and down. So what that means is we need to take our H1 element. We're going to make the opacity 0 by default. All right, so we're not going to see it anymore just yet. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and basically replicate this line. And we're going to say headline.classlist.add. And we'll say headline-intro. Now that class doesn't yet exist either. So let's just copy this one here. We'll say this is called headline intro. And for headline intro, we're just going to say transform translate y is going to be 0. So we're going to set it at its original position and then opacity 1. Oops, there we go. And then so down here, we also want to take the H1 element and we want to say transform translate y, maybe negative 30 pixels. That way, its starting position is up higher by 30 pixels. And then that way, when we add this class, transform translate y 0, we'll push it back down to 0. Finally, we also want to transition it so that it's not an immediate jump, and so that we can see same exact concept as we did with the splash moving up situation. So then we're just going to put in transition, and we want to transition 2 different properties. You could say all, or we could just say transform for 1 second, and then opacity we could do 1 second as well. And let's go ahead. We're going to add something to this, but let's go ahead and see what happens when we refresh. 2 seconds moves up. Oh, and it pretty much happens instantaneously. If you want to have a delay slightly, we can do transition dash delay of like 0.3 seconds. And so now that particular transition will take a little bit longer for it to occur, just barely noticeable. And that is basically it. Now we can refactor this just slightly. You should get in the habit of using functions when possible. So this stuff right here can be added into a function. And so we'll just call this remove splash. And I copied that, by the way. And then we'll say function remove splash. And then we'll just paste that in here. And then another thing we could do is a lot of times you'll see, especially when you're dealing with larger projects, we'll create a configuration variable called duration equals, let's say, 2000. The same value here, and then that way we can just put duration right there, and there we go. So now let's go ahead and take this, refresh, and there we go. Very nice, very simple, smooth transition. So now in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and put to the test more of the same information that you've been learning so far. So that is, interacting with the DOM at a very limited basis, working with variables, and also working with set timeout, and also working with the animation and attaching classes as well. Okay, welcome to the very first challenge that is a part of the JavaScript course. Now right here I have a Figma prototype, and this is going to be linked here on this page. So look above or beneath the video and you'll be able to take this project and duplicate it and open it up in Figma yourself, and then click play. When I say click play right up here, and you will see this right here. And this is what you're tasked with creating. You're going to be responsible for creating the HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript should you choose to participate in this. And honestly, if your goal is to learn, you should participate in this. So basically what we have here, the starting point should look like this. It has this little quote and then a little button right here. And when you hover over the button, I want you to utilize CSS to make this hover state as well. This is an SVG graphic, and you could just export that within Figma. And by the way, there's going to be a follow-up video to show you exactly how I create this project, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you get stuck, don't worry about that. In fact, I kind of expect it if you're brand new. I don't expect you to be able to pull this off. I do expect you to have a pretty good idea of how to create this in HTML, CSS, since that's kind of a prerequisite for this course. But if you can't get other stuff figured out, or maybe some of the CSS, that's not a big deal. So when you click on Discover What's Extra, this is what happens. All right, we can see we have this animation where the button slides off to the right and it kind of just disappears out of nowhere. And then on the inverse of that, from the left, comes this little unordered list right here. And this little button, it says plus a little bit of insanity. I just decided to make that a button so we could toggle back and forth. And this is the project. So it's going to utilize JavaScript in order to attach classes that will push things in and out, so to speak. And so if I show you over here, if I go back to the main Figma area, it gives you some details. Click play to play this prototype, create the HTML, CSS, and integrate the necessary JavaScript so that you create the layout and interactions as seen here. Here's the two screens. To take this right here, this button, you hold Control, hold Shift and Control, and you select both, right click, copy and paste as SVG. Then you can just paste that right into your HTML document to make that work. And then over here we have the design for what happens when you click on it. And there's something very important that maybe you don't know this technique, but in order to make things kind of just appear out of nowhere, we use a mask. And I used a mask here in Figma, but when it comes to HTML and CSS creating masks, it's obviously different. And so I kind of show you the basic markup for this idea. What you want to do is for both the image, or the button rather, that's going to have its own mask. You can kind of visualize it right here. Imagine this is like HTML element that says div class mask. And then where it says div class content right here, this would be like your button content. That could be like an ahref tag. And that would be contained inside of this HTML structure right here. Then in your CSS, you take this mask that's wrapped around it. It's the parent element of whatever content you want to show and hide. And you simply say overflow hidden. And that way, if you take content, for instance, this content class, and you create a rule set in CSS for it, and you say transition, translate X 100% or translate Y 100% or even 50%, it'll be cut off. It'll act as a mask. And that's how we're achieving this, and that's how we want to do it in HTML and CSS. And you'll find that that sort of thing is used everywhere when it comes to highly interactive websites. So what I want you to do is go ahead and try to tackle this. Tackle the HTML, create a game plan for kind of how you're going to create this 2-column layout with this little border in the middle. Trust me, there's many ways to do it. And then finally, after you get it all styled exactly as it should look like, make it interactive with JavaScript using everything you've learned so far. All right, and then after that, we can kind of compare notes. If you get stuck, not a big deal. Just look at my video after this where I walk you through this project on how to start it and finish it. All right, welcome to this brand new project, and hopefully what you were able to come up with is something that worked well for you. But if it didn't, I'm expecting it, especially if you're brand new to this. I'm expecting you to have frustrations and hiccups along the way, to completely normal. You're gonna learn by both trying and failing, and then seeing what I do and what others do, and then you're gonna become better for it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to head on over to our Figma prototype, and we have to have a game plan in terms of our HTML structure. That's the first thing you have to really think about. What HTML elements are we going to use to create this layout? And again, there's a lot of considerations here. So the first thing I typically do is I wrap everything inside of like a parent element. I usually call it div class of container. And it'll just wrap around pretty much everything. We can see we also have a 2-column layout. We have a column here and we have a column here. And by the way, in a real world scenario, you would probably have mobile variations of this. We're not making it mobile friendly because this isn't really a mobile design course. This is just, mainly just for JavaScript. So we're just only dealing with desktop only. So having said that, we have a 2-column layout that's meant to work with desktop. And we can get started there. I mean, as long as we don't have to have a full game plan before we start, but we just have to have a rough high level idea of like what the initial HTML is going to look like. So parent container, 2 elements inside of it for your left and right column. Let's go ahead and get started with that one. All right, so let's go ahead and put our div class of container. So just put period, that means a class, hit enter, and that gives us a div class of container. That's an Emmet abbreviation, E-M-M-E-T. If you want to look at my YouTube channel and type Emmet crash course, you can see all the fast ways in which you can write HTML with the help of Emmet. So then we're going to have 2 columns. I'm just going to call it class of left and then a class of right. Very simple. Now inside, for our left column, we have the quote and then we have the author. We could just put paragraph quote and then paragraph author, but I'm actually going to put another parent container called inner. And this is just going to help us kind of like position it within the left column, these 2 elements, because we're going to position them in the center essentially, vertically. So we have an inner, and we're going to have a paragraph of class quote. And then that quote here is, I'm going to go ahead and paste this. Copy and paste it right there. To become a great designer, you need more than talent alone. You need a bit more, blah, blah, blah. I will just go ahead underneath this. Another paragraph of, I'm going to call this auth for the author, Gary Simon. All right, that part is very simple. Now for div class of right, we're going to have quite a bit more markup just because we have more things happening that has to be shown and hidden. All right, so this is going to have an inner class as well. And then inside of here, we're going to have the mask. All right, so the mask, if you recall from the previous video where I introduced this challenge, it's a mask is a parent container with the CSS property of overflow hidden so that we can use translate transform X like negative 100% to push it off to the left or 100% to push it off all the way to the right. So we're going to put mask right here. And we're going to have 2 different masks because we want a mask for the button and then also a mask for that little unordered list. So I'm going to have mask 1. And this is, again, in Emmet abbreviations, we can chain these little periods right here and hit enter. And then it creates this markup for us. Mask 1 is just going to allow us to choose this mask specifically, as we're going to have a rule set specifically for it. So outside of that, we're going to have our button. So this is going to be the button right here that we're going to create. Now, if you look at the button, it itself is a 2-column layout because we have this element in one column and then we have this button in another column. All right, so with that said, the parent container can simply just be a link so that both things are clickable, the actual type and the little circle as well. So we're going to say A, hit enter. It's not going anywhere right now, so we're just going to put a hashtag there. And then we need 2 elements. So we can use a span element to house the type. So discover what's extra. And then this is where we copy and paste the SVG. Again, just to do that, all we have to do is go over here, take both of those, right click, copy as SVG. We're going to paste it in. Let's get this styled up a little bit better. We don't need a width and height. We're going to give it a width and height in CSS. And here's our circle and here's our path. This is all looking good. We don't need this right there. And there we go. All right. Now we have our first mask right here and we need to have a second mask underneath it for the unordered list. So we're going to say mask. And then the unordered list is simply UL. And then we have our individual LI elements inside, of which there are 5. So dedication is 1. There's a few others. I'm going to go ahead and just paste in the rest off screen. So consistency, perseverance, grit, and then we're doing LI here at the last one. Class is back. And again, you don't necessarily have to add this class of back to it. You could use a pseudo element, but the reason we're adding a class of back is because in JavaScript, we're going to target this element and make it clickable to revert back to the original state. So that's all we have to do for our HTML. Now, of course, if we were to take our Sass, and by the way, I already have this single rule set, which gives us the background and the font family. The font's being imported at the top here already in this document. Make sure we're watching that, and we right-click Open with Live Server. This is what our project looks like. Usually when you have SVGs and you remove the width and height attributes as we did, they just get massive. They fill out their container. So obviously we have some work to do. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and conclude this just to keep these videos separate. This is the HTML portion. In the next lesson, we're going to focus on getting the CSS ready and then finally the JavaScript. All right, so here's our very first rule set in CSS, or Sass rather, and we're just defining the background, color, font family, all that good stuff. And again, just to rehash this is what the layout currently looks like. So reverting back to our HTML, we have a div class of container with two elements directly inside of it, which is going to be div class of left and div class of right. So we could use flexbox, of course, for this on the container element. So we're going to put display flex. We're do justify content center to get it centered up, and then also a height of 100 viewport height to make sure it spans. So now we have, what is essentially two columns. We have our quote column, and then we have this column over here. After that, we're going to take also inside the left and the right elements here. So left, and we're just going to chain these together in this rule set for the selectors, and we're going to say display grid align content center. So align content works on the vertical axis, and then it will align it center based on the height of the parent container. We're also going to go ahead and put flex 1 because these are also flexbox children because the container is display flex, and flex 1 will make sure that they're of equal width essentially. So if we save this, there we go. They're going to take up equal space between them. I know it looks horrible, but that's the process. So we're also going to put some padding around it. So 0 on the top and bottom, but 8 viewport widths on the right and left. And that'll give us some nice white space all around, as you can see here. All right, so after that, we're going to do that little line in the middle. Now, because we gave these elements left and right a flex of 1, we know that the very right edge of the left element is going to be 50% in the middle. That's where we're going to put a single 1 pixel border that will go straight down the right side. So to do that, we're going to say left border. We want it to be on the right, and that'll be give us right in the middle of the viewport. 1 pixel solid, RGBA. This is the color function, and we can pass in 255, 255, 255 because it's going to be white, but only at 10% opacity, or 0.1. So now if we save that, we have this line that goes straight down the middle of the viewport. Great. So after that, we're going to go ahead and style up the left column type where it has the quote and all that good stuff. So this right here will take just a little bit of rule sets here. So the first one's going to be a paragraph of quote and also an unordered list. Font size will be 2.2 viewport width. Font weight will be 300. Using viewport width, typically you'd want to use something like clamp function on this, but for this quick, desktop only version, this will work just fine. So making it a viewport width unit for the font size makes it fluid type, which is pretty nice. Okay, outside of that, we are also going to target our quote and the author. And we're going to say text align right because we want it right align against this edge. That's basically how the design, how I designed it, and that's what we want to do as well. Also, we're going to take our author. Now, the author element right here, if we go back, we'll see we have this little dash right here. So we could just use like a dash on the keyboard, but to make it a little bit more dynamic and customizable, we're going to use a little trick here that is very common. I wouldn't call it a trick, I call it a pattern, something that's used very often. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to go ahead and take our paragraph auth, and first we're going to make the font weight bold. The font size is going to be 1.3 rem units. Position will be relative. Position relative is very important because it's acting as the parent element of a pseudo before or after selector. You're going to see what I mean in a second. We're also going to choose, we haven't used this in forever, but I use it still sometimes, float right which will keep it positioned to the right. Additionally, I'm going to say and before, and we're going to say content empty. Again, this is one of those, this is part of the pattern. First, we take the parent element and we say position relative. We put content empty, and then we put position absolute. That way we can say height 0. And again, this is for that little dash next to the author name. And we'll say width, we'll just hard code an absolute value of pixels at 20 pixels. And then a border bottom of 1 pixel solid white. The top will be 50% because let's get this right here, this position absolute in a relative parent container makes our positioning of top left, bottom right in relation to the parent. You'll see what I mean. If I remove this, it's going to break the whole thing. So top 50, because we want it to be in the vertical center. And then left, we're just going to say negative 30 pixels. So if I save this, oh, well, I kind of styled it so that it's on the other side. No big deal. Typically, it would be on the other side anyways. And so there you go. We have this little dash that we used with this pseudo element. Now, like I said, notice where it's at right now, right here. Now, if I go ahead and I remove position relative from the parent, it disappears. I don't even know where it went. It probably is off the side over here because I put left negative 30. So if I put left maybe just positive 30, notice it's like way over here. It's not in relation to its parent container. That, my friends, is why you put position relative on the parent container when you're dealing with position absolute child elements. All right, so that right there is pretty good. And again, the reason I spent so much time talking about that is because it's a very common pattern, just like this mask pattern as well. All right, a lot of talking. Now, let's go ahead and take our masks, because that's the next element that falls inside of these. We have our container, we have left, we have right. Now we have our inner, which we'll deal with, but we also have our mask right here and here. So again, remember what I said, we just take mask and we simply say overflow hidden. Nothing's going to happen at this point because we're not moving them outside of that parent container with transform just yet, but you'll see what I mean in a second. Now let's go ahead and switch gears, and we're going to focus on the actual button right here. And that's wrapped in an A element right here. All right. So it has two child elements of a span and an SVG. So with that said, let's get back here. We're going to go ahead and specify ACTA for our selector. The color is going to be white. We're going to have a display. Actually, I don't know why I did that because we don't need color white on that. We're going to do a display flex because remember it has two of those elements that are in a left and right column. A gap between them of one M unit. And again, this is so big, I want to go ahead and change the SVG size to 30 pixels. So because it's inside of the A element, we could just put SVG here nested inside of it and simply say width 30 pixels. And now it's going to be a lot better. Wait, no, it's not. Let's make sure I'm going to leave this in, by the way, so that you could watch me debug something, because I thought that was supposed to work. I mean, hey, this is the typical scenario of how things sometimes play out, even when recording courses and such. So we have our A CTA, which is up. That's why I never put a class. That's why it didn't work. There we go. Yep. So you want to check those things. Now you can see it's right here. Oh, the reason we made it white, by the way, is because default hyperlinks are blue. There we go. Let's save that. And there we go. Now we can see it much better. And what we want to do here at this point is put text decoration none. Transition is going to be transform, 0.4 seconds, cubic, Bezier. I forget which one of the presets it is, but I'm going to paste this one right here. And we're also going to align self flex end, which means it's going to position it at the bottom of the container, which right now you can't really see it making a big effect, but you just wait. You'll see in a second here. We're also going to go ahead and take our span, which is wrapping around this type right here. and we're going to make the font size larger. So span is going to be font size 1.3 rem. And we're also going to say on hover, let's get down here, text decoration, underline. We're going to bring back that underline on hover. So now if we bring this back, there we go. Okay. Next up, we also want to do the hover fill, where we change the SVG colors here of the circle and the little arrow inside of it. So to do that, we just say and hover. And again, this is in relation to a CTA. So when the whole CTA element is being hovered, we want to change the circle in the selector here. And we want to change the fill to white, because right now it has no fill, it just has a stroke of white. And then also we'll copy this, paste it, and change the path. And again, this is in relation to circle here and path here. And we want to change the fill to the website background color, which happens to be 242C38. Now, if we save this and we go back, there we go. We have exactly what we want. And that's also consistent with the Figma prototype. All right, so now we're almost getting finished with this. Now what we want to do, if we look back to our Figma document, the first screen has the unordered list here hidden. So that means we need to hide it. And remember, it has a mask, so we can hide it and just move it over. And the way we could do this is we target the UL. And with the UL element, we have to do some cleanup. So we get rid of default margin and padding, something I pretty much almost always do in terms of a pattern. List style type, to get rid of those little bullet points, we're going to say none. And then transform, translate X negative 100%. This part's important because guess what? It is hidden now. It went bye-bye. It actually exists if we look at the dev console. And we come over here, let's see here. Let me move things down just a bit. We could see that it exists. We have first class inner, this element, and then we also have this element. Okay, it is right there. You see that? That's because UL has transform translate X negative 100%. It is pushing it all the way off the view. We can't see it because mask, which is the parent container, has overflow hidden. If we untick that, guess what? We see it now. It looks terrible because it's overlapping, but we want to hide that. That's how that works. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to say right and inner. So we're selecting just the inner class that exists on the parent container right. And I'm going to say position relative. And then we're going to say mask 1, position absolute, and bottom 0. That's going to push that element right there. Okay. So now we click on it, nothing happens obviously, but we're basically at our starting point from our Figma document right here. It's pretty close. I think I have this at the bottom in line with the author, but yeah, same concept. All right, so we also have just a couple more. We have our unordered list. We're gonna take our list items. We're gonna do a margin bottom of 0.3 em just to create more vertical white space and separation between each of those list items. And then we're also gonna take li back, which is the class that we gave it. And this is the differently styled last item of that list. So it looks like this right here. So we have to do that style for that list item specifically. And so we say color. That color code happens to be 677A98. Just kind of like a soft blue. Font size is 0.7 em rem units. And then cursor is going to be pointer. All right. So we can't see that because it doesn't yet exist. But of course, if we do really want to see it, just temporarily, we'll just delete that. We'll bring this mask. I would take an unordered list and get rid of that. And there we go. So this is kind of what we have. If I made that an M unit instead of rem unit, it would be larger as it's supposed to be. So if I take the rem off and we get our unordered list back, there we go. It's a little bit larger. Okay. It's great. So that concludes all of the necessary CSS for this project. Now in the next video and the last video, we're going to work in that JavaScript. All right, so let's go ahead and get focused here on the JavaScript. So what we want to do is come out here and we want to first define some properties. And we know that looking at our prototype, this is clickable, like this whole button. So we're going to need to go ahead and get access to that. So we're going to say const CTA for call to action is going to be document.querySelector, and we're going to say .cta. Again, the class is up here, if I can find it, right there. So that is our class that we're getting access to. So if somebody clicks on this whole parent element, it's going to do something. Additionally, we're going to have another one of const details equals document.querySelector, once again, unordered list. All right, so this is our details. I'm calling this details, basically, this unordered list. And we need access to that in JavaScript so that we can attach a property, a style property of transition transform, or transform translate rather, so to move it into place when that is clicked. We're going to need one more called back, and this is going to be document query selector back, and that's in relation to this right here. This last one, because we're making this clickable just so we can kind of revert back to the original screen. Additionally, we're going to create a function. All right, so our function is going to be called detail panel. And we're creating a function out of this because it's going to be ran multiple times based on somebody clicking on the call to action, the button, versus the back button as well. It's going to be calling the same code. So it makes sense to wrap that into a function. Now we're going to have a Boolean value. So that's going to say let's show details, and we're saying let this time because we're going to be reassigning it a new value essentially of either true or false. By initially it's going to be false because the details of what it takes to be successful, the whole purpose of this whole section, are hidden. You have to click a button. So we're saying that's false. Then we're going to say inside if show details is false, and again, we do that with this little exclamation point, then do something inside of here. Well, what are we going to do? Well, we have to take our CTA and we have to do style transform equals translate x 110%. Now, at this point, if you're comparing your code and you completed on your own, you're also watching me, you may have chosen to use classlist.add and you added a class that you then later defined in the CSS. That's perfectly fine. But the reason I chose style right here is because it was literally only one property with one value. So using style is actually more advantageous in this context, in my opinion. That way you don't have extra code in your CSS. That's just unnecessary. We can just write it right here. And then we're going to do the same thing to the details panel. Style transform is going to be 0, which means by default, if we look at our CSS and we look at our, let's find it here, if I could find it somewhere, there it is. It's our unordered list is translate x negative 100%. So we're setting it back to 0 to get that list back into view. All right. And then finally, we want to take show details because we're showing them now and make it true. So let's just save this, and we're going to have to do an else as well. But for now, let's just save this and attach a event listener of click, and we're going to simply call detail panel, which is defined right here. So let's save it and let's click it. All right, so notice it kind of hid real quick. Nothing's going to happen when we click this because we haven't added an event listener on our back button. Save that. Oh no, it's not working. All right, so the reason it's not working is because we have to add an else right here. So if it is true, then what do we do here? Well, let's just copy these 3 lines. Oops, sorry. And we're going to say CTA style transform. This time we're going to bring it back into view to 0. This one will be negative 100%. Now, by the way, up here, you're probably wondering, why did I do 110%? That's because based on the Bezier spring that occurs, you can see a little bit of the edge kind of like off to the side. So I'm pushing it off further so that when that cubic Bezier style of animation makes it spring, you don't see it coming up for the edge. In fact, I can just show you. If I leave that at 100%, you can see it right there. Well, I'll zoom up real quick. Oh no, it's not working. And I can tell you why. This needs to be set to false. There we go. So now if I zoom up, you can kind of see it like kind of wobble back and forth off to the side. Now, this is not instant because we don't have a transform or transition property applied to it in CSS. So let's go ahead and remedy that real quick. So let's go back to our CSS and looking on my reference code real quick. Our CTA button, there we go. We have a transition, transform, but it's not the CTA, it's the UL. There we go. So we need to do transition, transform, 0.4 seconds, and then that cubic Bezier, we're going to use the same one. Right there. Now let's save it. There we go. Now to stop that little area right there, again, I'm going to make this 110%. Save it. There we go. All right. And that is it. So that is just one way of tackling this project. And hopefully you learned something with it. We're obviously going to ramp things up here because we're still dealing with the very basics of DOM manipulation and JavaScript. All right, let's continue on. Hello everybody, welcome to this brand new project, and this is going to be a cursor follow project. So it's basically we have a custom element of some sort that we styled, and we want it to follow the cursor. And this would be a great way to introduce the concept of objects in JavaScript. It's not something we touched yet, and it really makes sense to touch on it. And basically an object is just a collection of other variables. That's the easiest way to put it. It's kind of like an organizational thing. So can you get by without using objects with this type of work, like DOM manipulation and interactivity? Yes, you could, but when you start working with projects and certain features that are more complex, it makes sense to kind of group certain variables and functions and arrays together under a single variable known as an object. And it's just a collection of other elements, essentially. There's multiple ways to do a cursor follow sort of idea. We're going to do one way that it's quicker, but it's not quite as ideal. And then we're going to refactor it, which will then utilize classes. So if you open with Live Server and you view the project, this is what it's going to look like. It just has cursor real big in the middle, and then way up here we have this circle, this little circle. If we look at the HTML, we have a div ID of cursor, which is that orange circle, and then we have the H1 here. Now heading over the SAS rather, we can see we have the body element, we have the cursor. We're specifying position absolute, a width and height of 60 pixels, a border radius of 50%, which will make it a circle. We also have our background, which is just an orange color. Make it whatever you want. Pointer events none is very important because the intention is to have the cursor behind, our custom cursor behind our real cursor. And if you go to click on a link or something, it won't work if you don't put the pointer events none right there for that line. Mixed blend mode, darken. This I'm going to delete that transition for a second. We'll add it back later. This is just, it adds a cool effect when it interacts and that cursor element goes over other elements. We can kind of see like things behind it essentially. And then just the H1, and that's what we have. So let's get started. The first thing, if we want this cursor, this div element, the circle to follow the real mouse cursor, then we need access to this element right here, which is the cursor. So the first thing we specify is going to be const, and we're going to specify it called cursor. All right, now I hit tab by accident, but yeah, we're gonna, instead of doing query selector, we'll do get element by ID. All right, so we have access to it now, and we don't have to have the hash tag there. And then what we need to do is we need to add an event listener on mouse move. All right, so every time the mouse moves, then it's gonna fire this event. So document.add event listener, make sure you spell it right, mouse move. Right here where it says E, we can change this to whatever we want it. Typically, the pattern is just to say E. You don't have to though. All right, and that's short for event. All right, and so now what we're gonna do is say cursor dot style. Now I say we're gonna back up just a tad bit. Let's console log that, and I'll show you what it spits out as a part of this event. So if I save that and we go back and I go and hit F12, you'll see all these mouse events that are firing every time it moves. And you'll see if we expand one of these and I zoom up, you'll see one called client X and client Y right here. So these are pixel values, like 1,186 pixels from like the left or so of the viewport. And client Y is on the Y axis. This is 432. So for that particular mouse event. Now these are firing like crazy. So all we have to do is do a transform on the little circle right here and change through the translate CSS property the X and Y values, and that physically will make it move around and follow the cursor. So to do that, all we have to say is cursor dot style, which means this gives us access to the CSS properties so that we can reassign values through JavaScript. So dot style dot transform, and this is going to equal, we're going to use backticks this time, which is the little key that is usually to the left of the number 1 on a keyboard. And inside of there, we're going to say, and the reason we're using backticks, by the way, is because it allows you to easily use what's called interpolation, where we can mention variables and also strings all within inside of these backticks. So we say translate, and then with the translate property in CSS works on an X and a Y value. So they're comma separated. The first value it has to be is a numerical value, and then we need an actual unit of pixels or percentages or whatever. So to get that value, remember it's client X, e.client X, and e.client Y. And if you think about it, this is kind of like an object itself where it says e.client X. It's a collection of other variables essentially. And so we'll get more into that later. So we're going to put e.client X, px, because otherwise it won't know what to do and won't work. So you have to give it a CSS unit. And then the same thing here on the Y. So e.client Y, px, just like that. So let's save that. And let's go back to our browser. And look at that. So if I zoom up, you'll see we have that mixed blend mode occurring here, which is pretty cool. And it works, but a couple things are wrong with it. First, the cursor is not in the center of it. That would be ideal. And then second, typically when you see this sort of thing, it's not like instantly falling. There's a lag usually. And you could try to do that with CSS transition delays and such, but the best way to do it is the more performant way, which is through what's called request animation frame. And so we're going to do that in our refactor, and in doing so, because we have to have access to multiple variables and different types of data, we're going to create our very first object. Okay, so let's go ahead and refactor this code. Now, what I want to do first is create our very first object. And how do you do that? Well, what we do is we're going to say let settings, So this is be a collection of different properties and variables essentially. And the way you declare an object is to open it up with the squiggly braces as shown. All right, so as you can see, it's already given some suggestions. We don't need those. But we want to store a few things so that we can then access them and update them, which is very important right here that we use let so that we can change the data essentially. So otherwise, if you didn't want to, you could just use const as well. And so what we're going to type here is mouse x is 0. We're going to update these things though, so don't worry about that. The mouse y is going to be 0. And then we're going to have an x position of 0 and a y position of 0. And this right here is specifically in relation to the div ID of cursor itself, the little orange circle, because the mouse X and mouse Y values aren't going to be the same because we have to apply an offset in order to get that little circle in the middle of the cursor. Before it wasn't, it was kind of off to the lower right. And then finally, we're going to add a speed property, and we're just going to set this to 15. This speed property will dictate and allow us to update it kind of as configuration settings, like how slow it takes for the cursor to catch up with the mouse, because we want a little bit of a lag. Okay, and that's our very first object. Now, objects can also allow you to create functions inside them. You can store functions inside them as well. You can store arrays. So if you wanted like a random array here, you can just create arrays just like that. Like I said, very powerful. It's just a collection of other stuff that already exists essentially in JavaScript. Okay, so now that we have that, we also are going to use the web animations API, and that requires kind of learning a new sort of paradigm, and that is perform animation with request animation frame. I know that sounds like crazy talk and it sounds very complex, but don't worry, it's not. I'll walk you through it. So in order to do this, we're going to create a function called animate. All right, so function animate, and inside of here we're going to put request animation frame animate. All right. So what this is doing is this is a function here that is going to call our own function right here that's inside of it. So every time this is ran, which is typically 60 times per second, 60 frames per second, it's going to call whatever, it's going to execute whatever is inside of this code here. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of like a paradox of some sort, a function calling itself all the time. That's essentially what's happening. And then we also want to call it when the page loads as well to essentially start the function. Otherwise, if you don't call it outside of itself, then it's never going to run. It's just a function that has not been executed yet. So we run it as well, and we call it here, and we call it inside of here. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so over here we had this mouse move over here. We still want a mouse move, and we're going to place it here near the bottom. And what we're going to do is we're going to update the mouse X and mouse Y variables within our settings object every time the mouse moves. So to do that, we just simply say, let me zoom up here, settings.mousex equals e.pagex. You can do pagex as well, and then page Y. All right, and this becomes Y as well. All right, so this is very cool. So everything's kind of tied together with just these few lines. So the very first thing that we have is we're defining up here an object. All right, it has mouse X, mouse Y, and all these other ones. Then we're also right here, every time the mouse moves, we're updating these two values of mouse X and mouse Y with the e.pagex and page Y. And then also at the same time, when it loads, we're calling animate, and which starts running the animate function. And then this line right here we'll keep calling it 60 frames per second. Now, that in and of itself won't do anything because it's empty outside of just request animation frame. We need it to do something. So the best way to demonstrate this without getting too deep is just to console log something. So in this case, if we console log our settings object and call specifically mouse X, for instance, we should see that updating all the time. So let's just do that. Console log, and we'll do settings.mouse X. We can also do settings.mouse Y as well if we comma separate it. So now if we go back, we'll see those two values right here. Now, of course, it's not moving our cursor because we haven't tied that information to the cursor yet. And that's what we're going to do now. So inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to say cursor.style.transform, just like we did before, equals, and we're going to say translate. And GitHub Copilot is pretty smart, so it knows what we want to do. We just want to get the settings, not the X position. For now, we're just going to do the mouse X and mouse Y. So mouse X, mouse Y. Let's save it. All right. So this is exactly where we were before, except we did it in a more complex way. So the payoff doesn't really make sense at this time because we actually have more code to get the same exact result. But that's not the end game here. We want to fix a couple things. The first thing we want to fix is we want to get this circular element so that the very tip of that cursor that I'm moving around is in the center of the element. And there's multiple ways to go about this. Some ways are better than others. So the best way to do it is, one way to do it would be, okay, we already know the size of 60 for the width and height of 60 pixels for width and height, but so we could hard code that. But there's a better way to do it dynamically where we can tell JavaScript to get the size of the element for us. That way, if we go to change the size of this right here in the future, we don't have to do anything. It's going to get the size itself. And so we haven't done this sort of thing yet, but it's actually really easy. And so we're going to call a method, and that method is called offset width and offset height. So here's how that works. We're going to say right here, let cursor width equals cursor dot offset width. Now again, cursor is already defined up here, and when you use get element by ID or a query selector, it provides you with offset width. That basically tells you it's the width of this particular element. All right, we're going to replicate that. So Shift Alt down, and this is going to be cursor height. And of course, offset width changes to offset height. Great. So now that we have those two, nothing's changed. We're just storing and declaring those in a variable. But what we want to do now is we want to update the X position and the Y position now that it's not tied explicitly to the settings mouse X and mouse Y. So the way we do that is we're going to say settings.xpos. And this is the real interesting part. We're going to use right here the plus equal operator. This is going to add a numerical value to itself. And the reason this will work is because request animation frame is continually calling itself. And this is where that speed element will also come into play, because we're going to use a little bit of math to make it lag based on the speed and direction of the cursor. So plus equals, we're going to open up into parentheses, settings.mousex minus settings.xposition. And then we're going to divide that by settings.speed. I know it's a little bit complex here, but hang with me. And the point at which this cursor width and cursor height comes in, it actually comes into play in this line right here. And you'll see that in a second. So this right here, the X position and XY, is for the speed element. So we're going to replicate that line and change this to Y position. So again, we're just updating the X and Y position in this object in the animate function. And we're doing this 60 times per second. So now all we have to do, now all we have to do is put Y position here, or mouse Y, and then settings dot Y, and we keep setting speed. So if we look at this here in the browser, we will see that nothing appears to change, and that is simply because in our transform, we're not taking into account the new X position and Y position. We're just explicitly tying it to the mouse X and mouse Y still. So we're just going to modify that and then also work in our cursor width and cursor height to get that repositioned to the center. So here's what this is going to look like. And once we understand how the X works, it's just a matter of changing how the Y works as well. It's the same exact concept. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take this mouse X and we're going to change this to X position. And then we're going to subtract the cursor width, and we're going to divide the cursor width by 2 so that we can find the middle of it. All right, then we're going to take the same concept. We're just going to take everything from here to here, from there to there. This changed to Y. This is changed to height. And it's still divided by 2. So this is what it all looks like right here. So now that we're using X position and Y position instead of settings.mouseX and mouse Y, we should see a lag here, and it's going to look very smooth and very cool. Oh no. I have an issue. Oh yes, I forgot to put the unit at the end. Make sure you put pixel at the end there for the height. Go back, and here we go. So notice how it's just nice and smooth, and it kind of just has a lag. We can change how slow or how fast by simply updating the property in the speed property in the object. So if we change this to like 40 or so, it's going to go a lot slower. It's going to take forever for it to catch up. Whereas if we change this to like 8, you'll see it's much quicker, and that way it gives us a nice way to control and allow anybody else to easily modify the settings object right here to control the speed. So hopefully you understand now that the utility of working with objects, and again, it's primarily for an organizational concept when you're working with bigger projects, more complex elements. You can store everything in a central location and then access it. And so a lot of what we've been working with already operates on this object paradigm. For instance, document is an object that has a bunch of other elements like functions that we can call. And so this is how we create those ourselves right here. All right, everybody, welcome to the very first project here that's a part of the Advanced Front Ends course. If I refresh this page, you are going to see this. All right, so this is what we're going to be teaching, the very first concept of the GreenSock animation platform, otherwise known as GSAP, in this course. And as you can see, it's very simple. So initially, these projects that we create are going to be very simple like this. Even though some of you might think this looks pretty complex, we kind of have like this little line that animates, and then it opens up, and then we have that text kind of like floating in and out. To achieve this with pure vanilla JavaScript, especially if you watch the free JavaScript Fundamentals course that I had, I would take some thought process in terms of getting this ready, but GreenSock Animation Platform is going to make it very simple. So let's go ahead and make sure you open up the project files for this particular lesson. It's called boring because it's kind of like a boring project, but it's going to really help demonstrate some key concepts when it comes to understanding GreenSock Animation Platform. So if you look at the index.html, we'll see that we have a h1 element that says boring. We have a div class of progress, which is just that middle line that kind of just animates over. And we could see that we also have no JavaScript. So this is the starting point. You saw what's pretty much going to be the endpoint here at the beginning of the video. In our main.sas file, we only have 3 rule sets. There's nothing exciting happening here. Our body element, we have an H1 element, kind of just getting that into position. And then we also have the progress div element, which is in relation to this line right here. Now, the one thing that's interesting about this one is we have a background color, a height of only 3 pixels. Width is 0, positions absolute, and tops 50 to get it kind of, in the middle of the browser. Width 0, so if I type in 50% or 50% right there, and make sure that you're watching the SAS and we are opening it with the live server, you'll see right here this line that goes from 50%. So our goal is to make that line grow, all right, from 0 to 100%. And we're going to use GreenSock animation platform for that. So initially, we're going to set that initial value at 0 right here. All right, so now we just don't see it at all. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So now the first thing we need to do in order to get this all animated, we have to include the GreenSock animation platform. And we're going to be using a CDN for this. And that's just like a very quick way of getting it integrated into a simple HTML project like this. We will look into other ways of integrating into more robust environments with NPM or the Node Package Manager later on in this course. So whenever you need to import the GreenSock animation platform, like you could literally type in, if you have GitHub Copilot here within Visual Studio Code, like import GreenSock 3 or something like that. And when you do that and hit enter, it'll give you right here, if I hit tab, a script that, a CDN essentially. But you really have to be careful with that because it might give you like an old, outdated version. So what I tend to do for these simple demos right here where we're using a CDN is to simply say GSock, or GreenSock rather, 3 CDN. And I usually come down to the CDN.js and I copy the script tag of this one. So it's 3.12.2. This was 3.7.1. So this is an actually old version. So you want to use the updated version for sure right here. Okay, so now that it is included, we can delete that line as well. We can go ahead and get started with writing the JavaScript. So the way GreenSock Animation Platform works at its most fundamental level is after we've imported it, we can simply use the to or the from to method in order to start animating elements. In this video, we're going to take a look at just from and to, and they do the same exact thing except opposite. All right, so we're going to use to, because what we want to do is we want to take that progress bar, which is currently at 0 pixels width, so we can't see it, and we want to animate it to 100%. All right, so it would make sense entirely to use the to method, not from. Okay, so I'll show you both though. And the way we do this is just simply say GSAP, and we have access to GSAP right here because we've imported it here up into the CDN. So GSAP, we'll say to, and then we're going to say progress, and then we're going to open it up. Now, a lot of times you're going to see that GitHub Copilot recommendations. Just ignore that for now. And what we want to do now here inside of this object, so we can see it accepts 2 parameters. First, we have the selector right here, which is just the class. So we don't necessarily have to say something like this. We don't have to say const progress equals document.query selector progress. We don't have to do this, but we can. You could just put it right in there. And obviously, when you're working with a more complex project, it probably does make sense to first define all your variables up at the top, and then you could just access them that way. Sorry. So we could stick with this right here. That's just fine as well. And then the second parameter is an object. All right. So if you recall, if you watch the fundamentals course, you open up an object with these squiggly braces right here. And now what we can do is we can literally animate CSS properties within this section. And then there are some additional properties that are specific to GreenSock Animation Platform as well. So one of the most basic example to make this work, width. We're going to say width, 100%. So if we save that and we go to our browser and refresh, there you go. Very simple. So we could also do a duration. So duration by default, let's just say 2. And when we do this, we're also going to see that it's a lot slower. And you can also see it's not a linear animation. It's sort of it slows down near the end, so it does have a default easing. We can also specify an easing. So if we type ease and we type something like power 1 in out, which you're probably confused, like where did you find that information from? Don't worry. We could see that it's pretty much almost exactly similar to how it was animating before. Now, if you type in GSAP 3 easings in Google, you're going to see 2 different documents from the same domain, assuming it hasn't changed. Of course, search engine results can change here quickly. But we can see that we have easings and then eases. So you want to make sure when you click on this, it says right up here, and let me open up very quickly my zoom tool. There we go. So if I zoom up, make sure right there it says 3.x, unless there's a version 4.0. You want to make sure that you're working with the latest version. And what's really cool is they have this editor that shows you easings and such. So you have like power 4, and this little green bar right here kind of just demonstrates how an element will animate based on these various different types of easings. So let's say, for instance, we want power 4. It shows you in the code right down here what this might look like. Now, typically what I do is I just copy this right here and I put it into the properties in the object. So I'll copy this, power 4. We'll go back. There we go, power 4 out. And it's going to affect our animation and what it looks like. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. So click that. It kind of goes in fast and then gets a lot slower at the end. So you can really experiment and play with that. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's take a look at what else we can do. Like say, for instance, this boring text. We wanted to make it kind of bounce in and out like with the elastic easing. All right, so how will we do that? Okay, so all we have to do is we'll type in GSAP. Now, right now, if you look at the current position of boring, where it says that, we might want that to be the end position. All right, so we could use the GSAP from in order to make it go from whatever values we specify in JavaScript through GreenSock Animation Platform to wherever it currently is. So just to show you what that looks like, it looks exactly the same, except we're using the from method. So we say, not progress, rather, we'll just say H1. And then inside of there, we could say maybe in the Y value, so we use Y right here. So you can affect the CSS properties in some of them within GreenSock without explicitly having to use actual CSS properties. So Y right here is just going to allow us to move things from the up and down. X, of course, is going to be horizontal. So Y, we could say -200 pixels, that would be. And if you wanted to use a percentage, you use Y%. And then you simply say maybe -20% or so, just like that. You don't actually put the percent in this case. So we're just going to say Y -200. And then we're just going to save and see what happens. So refresh. Okay, pretty boring, but you can see they happen at the same exact time. All right, so we could go ahead and give us an easing. And if we go back to the easings page, and I believe that would be, well, let's go to history. Let's see, right there. We could see that elastic, if we want it to bounce, we're just going to grab this code right down there. I'm going to copy it. We're going to go back, save it, and let's refresh. Okay, now that's really kind of strange and too fast, but it's a very cool spring effect. So if we say duration 2 seconds, it's going to be a lot more slow and smooth. So there we go. It's very, very, very cool. and obviously very powerful. So let's also do one more. Let's say, for instance, when that progress bar goes all the way up, we'll expand the height from 3 pixels, because that's where it currently is set at in the CSS, from 100% height. So let's figure out how that would work. Well, we can say GSAP2, we'll say progress, and then we're going to say height, 100%. All right, and let's just see what happens. I know it's not gonna work correctly. Just watch what happens. Well, because everything fires at the same time, it's pushing it all the way out and also making the height 100%. And because of how I have it positioned with CSS at top 50%, it's not consuming the whole screen. It's actually going down here. So to fix those few things, what we can say first is top 0. All right, so now watch what happens when we do that. Now it's kind of like expanding the screen at the same time, but we don't want all these animations occurring at the same time. We don't want these two at the same time. So what we can do to fix that is we can give it a delay, maybe of 2 seconds. So let's go back. There we go. Look how that just opens up. What's really cool is you can pretty much change any CSS property through here. So if we want to change the background color, and this part's very important. In CSS, the background color property looks like this, a background hyphen color. You can't use hyphens here. Whenever there's a hyphen, you remove the hyphen and we convert to camel case. So first letter is going to be lowercase, and then if there's 2 words as a part of it separated by a hyphen, you remove the hyphen and then just capitalize the next word. So background color, and then we could just say white. So now it's going to go from that light blue to white, full on white. You can make it black, you can experiment and do whatever you want. You could also put in custom easings on this and everything else that you want. Now, one thing that's important to note here is technically this is a sequence animation because first on the same element. So first on the progress element, we're making it expand out, and then we're also afterwards we're making it expand up as well and fill up the whole browser. Technically, you wouldn't want to do it like this. You would want to use the GreenSock timeline, which we're going to get into, and it makes our life a lot easier, as you'll find out. But for now, I think that's a good place to stop, and then we'll go ahead and test your knowledge with some an actual interactive test, and we will keep on learning because really we just scratched the surface. All right, welcome to our very next project where we're still just going to focus on simple tweens because there's a lot more to learn about them. As you can see here, we're in Figma, and I just kind of wanted to show you a before and after state in terms of a tween that I want to make. So by default, it'll start off looking like this circle where it says Lux or something like that, and then you hover over it, and then it will transform this, what looks to be a circle. It's actually not a circle, it's a rectangle with the border radius all the way up. See? And it's going to transform it into this rectangle and also scale down the size of luxury so it'll reveal it. Let me show you what that looks like on the end state in the browser. So we hover over it, and there we go. Just a very nice sort of sleek animation that we created. Okay, so in doing this little very simple project, we're going to learn more about these tweens. So I'm going to go ahead back here to my project, and as you can see, the markup is super simple. We just have a div class of container with which is going to be the rectangle that looks like a circle and then transforms, and then we have luxury inside of it in a paragraph tag. We're also including GSAP through a CDN, and we've also created a reference or a variable to container with query selector container. Very simple so far. Let's check out the CSS, which is also very simple. This right here, we can go ahead and just kind of ignore that for now. But yeah, nothing special is happening in the body. We have our container, which again is the border radius 50%, background is orange rather, not purple. Yeah, very simple stuff here. And then we have our paragraph. So we want to make sure that we are watching this and so that we can see what's happening in the browser. So here is ours. And obviously there's no interactivity right now because when we hover over it, nothing happens. We haven't written any type of JavaScript. Okay, so one of the very first things I wanted to talk about here is something called FOUC, which is an acronym for flashing of unstyled content. And really it's a issue that occurs depending on whether or not you're using from or you're using to. And I'm just going to demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about so that you can understand what I'm talking about. And then that way you'll understand when does it make sense to use from and when does it make sense to use to. Okay, so let's say for instance, we decided to style the end result by default in the CSS. So the end result, this is the starting. This is not the end result when you hover over it. If we go back to Figma, this right here is the end result. So if we style our initial CSS to, end up looking like this when the browser loads, and then we could just use from, the from method in GreenSock animation platform for the hover, then it will go from that value that we specify in the JavaScript to this value right here, which is the default value. And you're going to see what happens, and it's called flashing of unstyled content. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with that. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to uncomment these lines right here because I'm just overriding a few key properties that we're going to be animating. The only properties that we need to animate in order to get everything to work is just the border radius right here, the width, and the height. So this overwrite right here is basically taking it from the initial state to the end state. So for instance, if I just hit save, we have this. If I bring that back and save it, then we are in this square format essentially. So we're just going to say for the purpose of this demonstration, we're starting with the end state. Okay, so if we go back to index right here, let's write out some JavaScript to get started with this little example. So what I'm going to type here is going to be GSAP, and we're going to use the from method. All right, so we're going to choose container, and inside of here we're going to have a border radius of 2%, because remember, oops, we have to put that in quotes, because remember, if we go back to our SAS file here, okay, so border radius 2%, that's the end result. What we want is the initial starting point, which is 50%. That was a brain fart on my behalf. And we're also want to have a width here of 16 viewport width and a height of 16 viewport width. All right, so if I hit save, on page load, it's going to start like that by default. But we don't want that to play initially. We want to use a new property that you haven't used yet. It's called paused. We're going to set paused to true. All right, so when we do that and I hit refresh, you can see every so often a flashing of unstyled content, and it's there for a split second. I'm hoping that based on the frame rate you can see this. I'm just continually hitting refresh, and every so often you'll see the original square, and that's because we're using the from method and we're styling it. We're waiting for the JavaScript to load, and we're styling it back to this circle right here. So in this context, it makes sense not to use from. We want to use to. And so in our CSS, we want to adjust this. I'm going to remove this so that this is our starting CSS, the starting point, the circle. Because that's where the animation starts, that's where it makes sense to have the browser load at that point. I just wanted to hit that home as much as possible so that you understand when to use from and to. In this context, it makes sense to use, it makes sense to start off with the initial start point in your CSS and then use to get to the end point. hope that makes sense. And if not, it will as we progress throughout this course with all of the many examples that we're going to have. Okay, so we're just going to change this to 2, and then we have to revert this back to 2% because we're going to the square now. I think 20 viewport width and then 28 viewport width as well. And now if we go back, we're going to refresh this, and you're going to see there's no flashing of unstyled content. No matter how many times I hit refresh, it is good to go. Okay, so right now we used pause true, which means this will not run. And what we could do is, because we want this based on a hover, we're going to say container, add event listener. We're going to say mouse enter. So when the mouse enters over on top of that little circle, we're going to go ahead and do what exactly? Well, we could just go ahead and take this code, paste it there, take off paused true. We can get rid of this one up top, hit save, and then we hover over it. There we go. It works. But a better way of doing this, because remember, when we hover out of it, we have to have a mouse leave event, which means we're going to be basically, our code is going to be verbose. It's going to be unnecessarily, an unnecessary amount of type, essentially, amount of code. Because if we do mouse leave, for instance, we have almost the same code, except we're just changing the property values. So this would become 50%. This is 16 viewport width, and this is 16 viewport width. So now if we save this, all right, there we go. It works for the most part. We haven't styled yet the type. But this is not ideal. The better way to do this is, let's go ahead and remove this one right here. We're going to go ahead and copy this, but delete it. And then outside of our mouse events, we're going to go ahead and assign this code block right here to a variable. So we're going to say let tween equal. Now, when we do this, it's still going to run this animation code right here because we haven't put pause true. So we want to put pause true. All right, hopefully you're following me so far. Now what we can do, now that we've assigned that code to a variable, it unlocks certain methods that will exist on this variable of tween right here. So what we can type is tween.play, just like that. All right, so then we could say tween.reverse on the mouse leave. Now notice how much more simplistic this code is and less verbose it is compared to simply taking this, copying and pasting it in each of the mouse events. So now if we save that and we hover in and out, there we go. Perfect and works awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and get the type scaling down as well. So to do that, we'll just create another tween. Now, in the future, we'll use a timeline for this, but we haven't yet got to that. There's still some more things I want to cover. So I'm going to say let tween2 equals GSAP2, the paragraph. And we're going to say font size. And I'm just going to use a clamp property here. And then we're also going to say x0. So on the horizontal axis, we're setting it to 0 because right now we have transform translate x 30% in the CSS. We're also going to a smaller font size. And then finally, we can also put paused true here. Then down here, we could simply say tween2.play and tween2.reverse. This, by the way, like I mentioned before, is not the ideal way to deal with a kind of like a sequence animation. We're going to get into a timeline very shortly, but you can also do it this way for now. And as you can see, the type scales down and moves over from 30% to 0. All right, welcome to this brand new project and lesson here where we're going to continue learning more about the fundamentals of GSAP tweens. Okay, so let's refresh this and I'm going to show you what the end result is. This is our goal. This is what we want to create. As we can see, we have these three images kind of sliding in sequentially, a stagger animation. And then after they slide in, we're actually going to use a onComplete callback to call a function that will then run another animation which begins right at the end of this one right here, where you see the type fall in and also the background scales down slightly. We'll watch it one more time. Here's the first animation, callback for a new function that runs another tween that moves these other elements in. So we're going to learn actually about three different new things in this lesson. The first one is going to be stagger. And the next one after that, or actually the first one, is going to be set method. And then finally, we'll also learn how to call functions on complete to make these more dynamic. Okay, so let's talk about the HTML markup real quick. It's actually pretty simple. We have an entire section that just houses the entire gallery. We have a div class of mask. Each one of these, we've seen this technique before where we just put overflow hidden on the mask element and then we can make things move in and out, so to speak. We also have an image here. These are in just the regular root folder right here. These are from unsplash.com. And then finally, we just have a paragraph. These are just for little titles, basically. The Sass right here, there's nothing too crazy happening. There's only a few rule sets. I'll let you look at that as you wish. There's nothing too crazy happening here. The paragraph element, you can see we have a transform of translate -50. That just centers it vertically and horizontally. But anyhow, nothing really special is happening here. So we have our GSAP import, and let's get started with the very first thing that we're going to learn, and this is something new. We're going to use the set method. All right, so the set method is something that you may use quite frequently, and it's basically the same exact thing as the from method or the to method, except it's with a duration of 0. All right, so you use set instead of that because you could use from and just use a duration of 0 if you wanted, but set allows you to quickly set properties once that call is initiated. In this case, since we're running this on page load, if we put it right here, gsap.set, it's going to run that instantly to set the CSS properties of your target element however you want them. So it's just another way to set your positions and your various CSS properties. So we're going to set the images. So the image tag. So yes, in this case, it would be kind of like an array because there's multiple images here. There's 3 different image elements. And so we can certainly specify multiple elements. And in this case, they'll be treated like an array. I also wanted to point out that here in this first parameter, if I zoom up, you'll see we can also put multiple elements. So if we wanted to select maybe perhaps an H1 element, and then maybe we'd also want to select a span element, we can do so in this manner right here through an array, just to let you know that. So we're just going to specify img to select all images, and then we're going to set the y% to -100. Because we want those to hide. We want them to be all the way up at the top outside of the mask. Because remember, each one of them has a mask. So if we save this and I go back to our actual regular project, we'll see we have the type here still, but the images themselves are gone. So we're going to do the same thing with the actual images as well, except we're not going to use y%. We're going to go ahead and specify opacity 0. So if we save that, we'll see now we see nothing at all. Okay, that's exactly what we want. So now, next up, what we're going to do is we're going to make all those images slide into place. And we're going to do it in a staggered manner. And it's so simple, it's just simply one property. So we're going to say GSAP2, we're going to say img, quit reading my mind, GitHub Copilot. We're going to say y% 0, all right, because remember, we're setting it initially with -100. We're also going to specify a scale of 1.3, so we can enlarge things easily by a factor, from all the way from 0 to plus, anything beyond. And I think we want a little slight delay before this triggers. So we'll just use 0.5, which is a half second. And I think we're pretty good right there. If we save this and we come back, notice how they all fall into place. That's because we have not used the stagger property. So if I go back, I put stagger, and then we'll put stagger just maybe at something like 0.1 seconds. Notice how they come in with a 0.1 second delay between each one of them. Very, very, very cool. So stagger animations are something you're going to be using a lot of. We're also going to specify in here an ease, power 4 out. And that just kind of makes the animation a little bit faster, maybe a little bit more interesting. It comes in quicker, that's for sure. We can always take the duration and say maybe 1.5. There we go. It's nice and smooth right there. And then at the same time, at the end of that animation, we want to have another animation that fires thereafter. And there's multiple ways of doing this, but I just wanted to show you this way of doing it. And so what we could do is we can say on complete, and then we can call our own function. So we're going to say scale down and fade in. And you'll see kind of what that means here in a second. So this is a function call right here, and this means when this is completed, when this animation completes, we'll call this function. So let's go ahead and define that function as scale down and fade in. And inside of here, we just put a GSAP 2. So we'll say image, the scale will be 1, and we're just going to say duration 2. So watch what happens here now. Comes in, and there you go. It scales down the image back from 1.3 to 1. Very, very nice. Outside of that, we can also say something like GSAP 2. Now we're going to take our paragraphs and we're going to fade those back in. So we're going to say opacity 1 and Y50, which means we'll move it down. We're going to stagger them because there's 3 of them. So we're going to stagger them at like 0.3, and we'll give it a duration of 2. So we'll save that. Let's check it out. Calls the function, and they all fade in. This one's white because I set that in CSS, by the way. So this here is very, very cool. Now, I kind of lied about one thing. I said we're going to learn 3 new things, and we did. We learned the set method. We also learned on complete. And we also learned that we can use stagger in order to stagger our elements based on how many are found. We can do something else, and that's called from to. So there's to, there's from, there's also from to. And from to is typically not used quite as much as those two. Let me go ahead and get this over here. There we go. But I did want to show you what that looks like. So for instance, if we comment this code out right here, let me go like this. There we go. I do not want arguments in there. Okay. So what we could say is we could say GSAP from to. This is what that method looks like. We'll take our paragraphs. And in this case, we have an extra object parameter. And so the first element that's within these squiggly braces, the object, is the from. So we can actually set both the from and the to properties of a single element. So for instance, say we want to do a negative or a y of negative 50 pixels. All right. That means that's where it's going to come from. And then we can also, let's move this down. All right. Then we put our from in the next object. So that would be opacity 1, Y50. So it's actually going to travel 100 pixels because it's going from negative 50 to 50. We're going to do a stagger of 0.3 once again, a duration of 2. And just to let you know that this is actually doing something interesting, so it's more obvious, let's do like an x of negative 50 as well. And then we'll say x over here is 0. So we'll save that. Here we go. Notice how they slide in from the left and right. Awesome, awesome stuff. Now, one final thing that I want you to know about, if we could type in GSAP 3 tweens here in Google, you'll find in the docs, there's a huge page on the documentation. This goes on very long, as you can see, but the docs, of course, as they say, are your friend. GSAP 2 from and from to, and it's going to give you a ton of examples and all of the cool things you do. You can pause, you can seek, you can choose progress, play, and reverse, which we've already done. Right here, this is going to give you all the special properties that you can use when you're using from and to in the object portion of the code. For instance, like write X and Y. All these things right here, all these properties you can use, and it tells you what they do. Of course, we haven't used anywhere near all of them. For instance, we used onComplete already, which is a function call when the animation is completed. You can do onRepeat. You can call all these, initiate all this interesting code through functions based on these properties, based on what you want to do. So you have a massive amount, here's stagger, of flexibility. Yo-yo is a very cool one as well, where it will kind of like repeat and reverse your animations. And then also down here, if you scroll down further, you're going to find methods. All right, so the methods are like play, reverse, from to, from. So there's a lot of different methods that you can also utilize as well, some of which we were going to use throughout this course. All right, so here is my approach and solution for that project. Let's first take a look at the HTML. I don't have the JavaScript written yet. We'll get to that, but the HTML I do, along with the CSS. So we have an image source with the ball.svg, which the ball.svg is right here. We also have a div class mask with the h1 inside of it, and then we have a div class loader for that line that goes behind it. Now for the Sass or the CSS, we can see we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rule sets. So we have a background, we have the image and loader. So the image itself, which is the basketball graphic, and the loader is position absolute, top, left, and transform. These three values and properties just basically take a position absolute element and just center them horizontally and vertically. We also have the H1 element, nothing special here, the mask overflow hidden, and then the loader right here, which we have a width of 100%, a height of 1 pixel, background of white, and then z-index of -1. So it's behind the ball. Okay, so if I load this up right now without any JavaScript, this is what we look like. So we basically have the end state styled. We can use the GSAP set method in order to set those various properties to the initial state. All right, so that's what I'm going to be doing. And so in order to do that, first, we're going to create some constants for these three elements right here that we want to animate. So we have a constant of ball, which is query selector image right here. We also have the H1, which is this element right here. And then we also have the loader, which is the div class loader. Outside of that, we also are going to have our set properties, all right? So GSAP set, we're going to set the ball to Y% -600. That actually gets us outside of the viewport. We have rotation Z of -295 degrees. And again, that will rotate it so that it rotates when it falls in. We also have the GSAP set of H1, Y% -100%. So that means it's going to be up and outside of that mask. We also have GSet loader, scale X is 0. So on the X axis, which is horizontal, it's scaled all the way to 0. And then we want to make sure we use transform origin, I think it's middle or center, in order to get it to scale out in the background. So we'll see what that looks like in a second. Actually, did I have to use transform origin? No, I didn't actually. It kind of just scaled in naturally because of how we chose to center it as position absolute. So never mind that. So now we're just gonna have literally 3 simple 2 calls. So GSAP 2, the first one's gonna be the ball. And we're gonna say Y% is just -50. We're gonna have rotation Z of 0. Duration of 2, ease is going to be bounce.out, and that gives us that nice bounce situation. So if I go back, refresh it, there we go. All right, next one, GSAP2, we want to take the H1 element and then we're going to do a Y% of 0 along with a delay of 1.7. So now if we go ahead and we view this in the browser, it's going to come down. So 1 second, there it goes. And then also finally, the last call is going to be GSAP2. We're going to take our loader. We're going to do scale X of 1. So that's going to go from scale X of 0, which is defined in the set method up here, to 1. And then we also have a delay of 2. And then finally a duration of 2 as well. So now if we save this, we're going to have the whole experience. Now, is this the most ideal method, having these different two methods, kind of working with each other with delays? It's actually not. The preferred method when you're doing animations that have multiple steps like this, they're like sequence animations, is by using the timeline. And the timeline is what we're going to be covering next. All right, welcome to this brand new project, and also a way to learn something that you're just going to use all the time. So I cannot stress the importance of this particular video, and that is the GreenSock animation platform, or GSAP's timeline. Okay, so here I am in the Figma document for this particular project, and this is all I designed. Literally 4 elements. There's a rectangle here, and here. They're all even, split into 3 different rows, different colors, and then we have just this fake little logo for a fictional business called Oceana. My intention for this is just to create, a quick boilerplate design with no animation, and then we'll just use our imagination about how we can create a cool timeline-based or sequence-based animation that kind of just introduces this loader graphic, or this graphic. So this could be at the beginning of a website or something like that. If it's a website that's heavy in assets and it needs a preloader or something, you'll be able to take what you learn here and apply it to so many other different concepts though. So let me show you what I came up with in the browser and what we're going to essentially code here from scratch. And if I get the browser up, here it is. Now, this is the actual project we're going to be starting with. Let me get open the finished version, which should load up any second. There we are. Here it is. Okay, so let's refresh that and look at it a couple more times. So when we refresh, you're going to see those 3 different rows kind of fall into place. And then you're going to see at the same time the Oceana graphic kind of come in and wobble in from a mask. And then you're going to see the top and then the bottom rectangles kind of shrink, where the middle one expands, and then the logo falls into place. It scales down a little bit. So watch it again. And expands and shrinks. One more time. Now doing this all with GSAP 2 and from 2 is completely possible, but you're going to have a lot more code and it's going to be a lot more difficult to manage, and that's where the utility of the timeline comes into play. So I'm going to go ahead and scale down. This is the beginning state of the project. So we already have the HTML, and again, so far the HTML is so simple. I'm just having it out of the gate already, so we're going to have to code it from scratch. We just have a fade container, which is a parent of those 3 elements that are fade 1, 2, and 3, those 3 rows. And then we have a div class mask with the H1 inside of it, and that's all we have for our HTML. That's super simple. For us, our CSS, again, there's hardly any rule sets here, just a few. Our mask, because there's only one mask element, I'm just taking this one and I'm utilizing these few different parameters here, or these properties, to position absolute and then top left transform. These values work together to take an absolute position element and center it vertically and horizontally within the browser. We also have our fade container, which houses, it's the parent of those 3 elements. So we're using grid. Grid template rows, repeat 3, 1 fractional unit. That means all 3 of them are going to be the same exact height no matter what. There's only 1 column here, so that's just 1 column, and a height of 100 viewport height. Additionally, we have each of our little elements that are differently colored blue shades. Notice how I am commenting this out, and I'll tell you why in a second. Transform origin top for when we scale things. changing the colors here, and then the H1 element, we're also uncomment. We have a comment here where translate X is negative 100% to get it out of the way. So with that said, what this project looks like, this is what it looks like. There's no animation because we don't have JavaScript yet, and this is basically the endpoint. But in order to avoid that flashing of unstyled content, or FOUC acronym, we're going to take our H1, transform translate X negative 100%. We're going to get it off the screen. And then also same thing with these different transform elements. Those 3 rows of differently colored blue shades are going to be scale Y 0. So we're scaling it on the Y axis, which is vertical, to 0. Then that's going to be the starting point. So now if I go back here, you're going to basically see nothing because the background of the page is white by default. All 3 of those elements are scale Y 0. And then also we've shifted off out of view the H1 element. So with that being said, that's our starting point. Let's go ahead inside of our script area and let's start creating our very first timeline. So the way we do this is we're going to say const timeline equals gsap.timeline methods. It's the first time we're using this. And then you can just leave it just like this. So you've created a reference to a timeline in the name of a variable called TL. You can call it whatever you want. We also will be adding some default properties which will apply to the entire timeline. So the timeline is very similar to and from, except it just allows you to organize your various animations in kind of like a timeline-based sequence. So you're still used to and from to, but it's within the context of a timeline that's defined right here. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like. We have to think about our steps. What's going to occur first? Well, I want those 3 elements that are currently scale Y 0 to be scale Y 1. All right, so how do we do that? Very simple. We say timeline and then 2, okay? Because we're going to a different state and we already defined the from state in our CSS. So we're going to say 2, and here's what's really cool about the 2 method. I think you know this already. I'm not sure if we used it yet, but in the selector, the very first parameter, you could put in an array to select multiple elements. So in our case, we want to select fade 1, 2, and 3, which is right here above. So we wrap it in brackets like an array, and we simply say fade 1, fade 2, and fade 3. There we go. Now the following will apply to all 3 of those elements that apply up here. So what would we say? Well, we say scale Y 1. If we hit save, there we go. They all come in at the same time and it works quite well. So what if we want to do stagger? We can stagger those maybe at 0.2. So let's save that. Let's go back and look at that. It looks a little bit more interesting, more dynamic when there's a 0.2 second delay between each one going from scale Y 0 to 1. All right, awesome. So at this point, we've done nothing different than what we've done before, except we have this weird line, GSAP timeline at the top. Okay, so what really starts to separate this is when we can chain these together. So for instance, if I tab this in, it says timeline, then we have 2. We can add, as long as we don't end it with a semicolon at the very end right there, we can go ahead and add another 2 or a from to method right afterwards. So let's say we want to have that H1 element come into view. So we can say 2, and we'll say H1, and we're going to say X 0. Because remember, right now, if we go to H1, to translate X is negative 100%. And all we have to do here in our GreenSock animation platform coding is just put X, and we put 0. So let's just see what that looks like by default. Okay, so what happens is it will wait for this animation, however long it takes, to be complete before it initiates this code here. So if we take the duration and make it 3 seconds, then it's going to wait the full 3 seconds for this animation to come into place. So hopefully that's very clear. It's a pretty simple concept to understand. So first this happens, and then second this happens. Okay. Now let me show you something that's very cool. What if we wanted to have this animation right here? What if we wanted it to start earlier and not wait the full time for this one to complete? Well, very simple. Right here, after the second argument, we could put a third one with a comma, and we put it in quotes, and we could put, if we wanted to start earlier, we put a negative equal operator. If we wanted to start even later, we could do a plus equal, which would mean there would be a delay before it starts. So we wanted to start sooner, so we're going to say minus equals maybe a half a second. So when we do that, you're going to notice it's not going to wait for all of them to come into place. It's going to start exactly a half a second earlier than it would otherwise. So now things are looking a little bit better and more aligned with each other. Okay, so we can also specify a custom duration for each one of these, as we've seen. So if we make that 2 seconds, it's going to take a little bit longer. That looks weird. However, when paired with an ease, we can say elastic out, we'll say 1 and 0.5. And I suggest tinkering with these two values to see how it affects the animation. So now this looks really cool, and we're able to make it very dynamic and interesting looking with little adjustment, of little code essentially. All right, so next one, let's add another one. Let's take 2, and we're going to select our fade 1 element, and we're going to specify scale Y 0. All right, so let's see what happens here after this one. This one at the top should just do scale Y 0. There it goes. So it waits at the end. Let's add another one. We're going to say 2. This time fade 3. It as well will be scale Y 0, which we could have just added a array to select both of these if we wanted them to be exactly the same. However, if I hit save and we watch this animation take place, they both go up and transform up like that. I don't like that. For me, I want that one the transform origin to be bottom, so that the top one goes up and the bottom one goes down. So the way we affect that is we tie into the transform origin property, which is a CSS property, transform origin. Remember, we're doing camel case here, and we just say bottom. And make sure we put a comma there. So if we save it, there we go. So now that one came down, it slid down. All right, now I want those two things to happen at the same time. So I'm going to put an offset on this one, and it's going to be negative equals 0.5. Now they should animate out at the same time. There you go. Very easy stuff. It's very exciting how dynamic this is and how much control we have over it. So let's also take our fade 2. When those ones are fading out, we're going to make that one fade, or not fade out, but they scale out to 0. We're going to make the middle one expand all the way out to the entire viewport height. So what we'll say is 2, and we're going to take our fade 2, which is the middle one, and we're going to say height 100 viewport height. Now, if I save this, and again, this doesn't have an offset, a time offset yet, so it's going to wait for those to finish. If we want it to happen real close, we could just do another offset. If we want it to happen at the same time, we could do negative 0.5 again. All right, now you still do see a little bit of a separation or a gap between the two, which is fine. And then the final thing we'll do is just do a 2 on our H1 element, and we're going to make a scale of 0.6. All right, so we're shrinking the size of the logo, and we're also going to do another negative offset of 0.5. So let's see what this looks like. Very, very cool. I like that a lot. So what's really cool is we also have defaults. So we can specify those defaults in the timeline up here. And the way we do that is we wrap it in an object. We say defaults with a colon, and then I want to make sure you can see this, another object where you have your default properties. So you could do stuff like specify a custom default duration, and then you could also do a custom ease. So let's do a custom ease of power 4 in out. And again, just look at the eases page for GSAP 3. for their little editor that shows you how to work with this. All right, let's also give ourselves a custom default duration of 0.5 seconds. All right, so let me make sure this is all working. If I put 0.1, okay, so we can really see it now. Like if I put 0.1 seconds, notice how fast everything has moved, which I think is just a little bit too fast. So if I change this to like 0.4, let's refresh here from the beginning. I like that even better. So as you can see, you have a tremendous amount of flexibility in each one of these to or from to methods within the context of the GreenSock animation platform timeline. And with this timeline, we're able to create really complex stagger-based and interesting animation sequences, which we're going to be using a ton of going forward. All right, let's go ahead and check out this project. I'm going to click on this button and we see this nice, quick, slick animation kind of come in with some easing, and then we click it again and it goes right back. And it's just so smooth. Now, the frame rate of this video doesn't really do it justice. When you're actually using this on a computer, it looks way much more smooth. So don't let that, affect your opinion of it, but it's just a really fun animation which we're going to use timeline. All right, so if we open up the before starter project, this is what you're going to see. We have some HTML already created. I'm going to go over that and we'll talk about, and we'll start doing the actual JavaScript here. So div class container is the overall element that holds everything, and it's basically a display flex, which means it's also going to have two columns inside of it. The first column is the aside. That is the dark menu that shows up right here. So when you load this up, this is what you see by default with this before project. It doesn't work, okay? So this is exactly where this is the starting point so far. So this is the aside, and then the main element, which is right over here and has this little menu toggle button, is this whole section right here, this light blue. All right, now I'm gonna switch back over here to our CSS, and I'm just going to point out just a few areas that make sense. For instance, that we have the containers display flex, so it takes those two columns, puts them into columns essentially. The toggle button, there's nothing special here, just a little hover effect right there. And then also, you're going to notice it says aside, we have this transform, translate x -100, as well as the main element. Those are our two columns. And if I uncomment both of those, we're just taking translate x. This one's 200%, and this one's 100%. I had to use 200% because it wasn't going all the way off the screen. When we make that change, there you go. It's hidden by default so that we don't have to deal with that flashing of unstyled content. So let's go ahead and make this work based on click. All right, so the first element that we're gonna need to define here in our JavaScript, I'm gonna hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar, is the actual button. We have to know when somebody clicks on it, right? So we're going to say const menu toggle equals document.query selector, and that's going to be our menu toggle. Menu toggle right there. All right, so we're also want to have a Boolean value that will help us determine if the menu is currently open or closed. So we're going to say let menu status, and we're using let because we need to change it, false. All right. After that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take our timeline, and we're going to define the timeline with a couple defaults. So if you remember, we define a timeline by saying const menu TL for timeline, and I'll zoom up here just a bit, and this is going to say GSAP.timeline, and I'm going to open these up in brackets. We're going to say defaults, and then also we can go ahead and open that up in brackets, and we're going to say a duration of 0.3, so things are going to kind of move quick, and also with the ease of power 4 in out. Okay, now doing that in and of itself doesn't actually do anything. We've only taken a timeline and we've tied it to a property called menu timeline. All right, so what we can actually do is start animating that timeline and then just say we'll just pause it immediately so it doesn't work. So we're going to say menu timeline right here. Let's zoom up just so you can see everything. And we're going to say 2. And we're going to wrap this in array because we want to take both the aside element, which is the side menu bar, and the main element, and we want to push them over back to this default state of X being 0. So we'll say aside here, and then we're also going to say main here. All right. And then after that, we're going to say X 0. And I want to stagger them slightly, so just 0.2. Oh, yeah, we have to make sure, by the way, that you wrap that in a parentheses. That, it wasn't showing me an error, though, which is kind of strange. That should work right there. Let's go ahead and save. All right, so if I refresh, notice how it instantly is animating. So we don't want that. What we would rather have is we want to pause it by default. So what we do is to say menu timeline dot paused, and we just passed in true. All right, so now if I save it and we go back, nothing's happening. Okay, that's exactly what we want. What we want to do now, and we're going to add to this, by the way, but what we're going to do now is take our menu toggle, and that's this right here. That's the actual button that's clicked, and we're going to add an event listener of click. All right, so let's remove this. Once it's been clicked, we can check the status of menu status. All right, is it true or false? So we're going to say if, and then if we put exclamation point, that means if it's false, so menu status. Then we're going to say menu TL dot play method, and then else we're going to say menu timeline dot reverse. Now, something we also have to do is set menu status to true, and then as such set it false down here when it's been clicked again. All right, so we're toggling between back and forth, these elements. So if I refresh this, here we go, we click it again, and they both go back in. Now, one thing that's strange is you're going to see an overlapping effect here that was not intended. See how the if I zoom up, this little hamburger menu is on top. You can see it on top of here. I didn't intend for that to happen. It wasn't happening in my original project. And what had happened is I'm fairly certain I know what the issue is. In the original project, I put main first here, and then aside second. Now, let's see if that fixes it. I think it might. There you go. Now we don't have that issue because it does take into account the order of the elements you're specifying in the array. So just keep that in mind, that the order, it's something I learned right now, will definitely affect your animation. But that's basically it. That's all it takes to do that. We're just moving things around with transform, translate X, and we're handling it within GSAP. All right, welcome to this brand new challenge. And this one is going to be challenging, despite it might not look all that complex, but it's going to cover a couple things that we haven't even covered yet. So if you're not able to pull this off, don't worry about it. I will be showing you the solution, obviously, in the very next module. But here in Figma, this kind of just shows you what the general layout is. Because the animations are more complex, they're outside of the scope of the animation and prototyping abilities of Figma. So I'm going to show you the live version of what I want you to try to tackle for this particular challenge. So this is what it looks like by default. It's just a few links, essentially, in an unordered list. However, watch this. We're going to hover over. So there's some very interesting things occurring here. And trust me, it looks way more buttery smooth. I'm looking at my reference monitor where it's showing the recording, and it's just not as smooth. But if you try this out, oh, it's so nice and smooth. So there's a few strange, interesting things happening here. When we hover over the text right here, we could see there's like two different titles. One is kind of like going up, and the other one's coming in on hover. So this initial one gets up out of view. I'll hover over the top link in a second. And then we have one underneath it that comes up into view. It's just kind of like an interesting sort of effect. We also have this little line over here that's kind of growing. It's a scale x0 to 1. And this right here, these titles are wrapped in a parent container, a div element, and that div element has overflow hidden. And then what we do is we use transform, translate x to move them, or not x, I'm sorry, y on the up axis, the vertical axis, to move them up. And so one hides and the other one reveals, and then when we mouse leave, it'll reverse the timeline animation. So I'm trying to give you some clues and some hints as to how to structure this. One thing that also might be a little bit challenging is the way you want to tackle this is you first want to set up a property, a constant that attaches itself to select all of the links, all 4 of these links. So all of the LIAs, essentially. I'm putting mine inside of a list item with the A element. And then you want to, for each, you want to iterate or loop over each one of those and create a timeline for each one that it iterates over. So if you don't get this, we haven't covered it yet, so don't get discouraged. I'm going to show you exactly how to do this sort of thing. And this pattern, this technique of doing a for each and then creating a timeline for each element lends itself to so many different use cases, as you will see as we progress throughout this course. So you don't have to worry about making it responsive. This is just for a desktop sort of interaction. So go ahead, give this a shot, get as far as you can. Then once you get really stumped, just watch the solution video thereafter. Alrighty, here is the project and the solution. Hopefully you came up with something, but you probably got stumped, so I'm not worried about it at all. So here's what my HTML markup looks like. And I'm going to take a little bit of time explaining this. First, we have a main element that kind of just wraps around absolutely everything. And so what I mean by that is if I hover up or come up here, we'll see we have a height of 100 viewport height, and so does the body have a height of 100 viewport height. And we'll see if we go over here, this is what it looks like by default when you load this starter project up. There's no interaction because we have no JavaScript. So this is kind of what it looks like. If I get F12, we're going to go back over here and we're going to take a look at elements and we're going to click on main. So notice when I'm select main right here, which is the element we're looking at, it's consuming the entire viewport. And that's important because we also use display flex and align item center, and that takes the element that's immediately inside of it, which is the section element. So there's only one child element inside of main, and that is section, and it will center that vertically within the browser. So next up after that, we have an unordered list, all right, an UL element, and then we have list items. So here's our first list item, and inside of our list item, we have just one more child element, which is an A element, because I want the whole thing to be clickable to take it to, like a fictional page. Inside of there, then we have a div class of heading container. So this is the element that has a overflow of hidden right here, as you can see in this line. All right, so if I check that off, you could see when we take off overflow hidden, it doesn't exist anymore. And so I gave it an explicit height of 40 pixels. And that really confines it to a certain just area. And you could see what that area looks like if I hit Control 1 instead. Come over here. This is the viewable portion of that mask. So the element that's beneath it, you just can't see it because it's overflow hidden. So after that, we also have our paragraph of, let's go back here. We have the UI UX 2019, and then we have that little line on the very left that comes into play. So that's all it is. It's just a bunch of 4 different list items, and they're all styled and exactly the same, except with just unique content inside of them. All right, so let's get started with the actual JavaScript rather. So for our JavaScript, like I said before, the first thing that we want to do is we want to take, real quick, let me look up my reference monitor. We want to take all of our links. We need access to all of our A elements, essentially. And there's one tool that we're going to use that you haven't used yet in order to do this. So you're probably thinking query selector all and just do LIA or something like that for the selector. Well, there's actually a better utility specifically for this thing that comes with GreenSock Animation Platform, which we've already included right here. And that is called GSAP Utils to Array. So let me show you what that looks like. Const links equals GSAP utils.toArray, and then we just put in the selector like we normally would. So we only have one list item element, one ordered list, so I could just put LIA and that's completely fine. It won't affect any other area of the site like footer links that are also LIA or something like that. And what this does, the difference between this is, let me show you the difference. So typically you might do something like this. This is maybe something you did. I'm going to say const links to equals document.query selector all LIA. What is the difference between links and links to? Well, let's just do a console log links and then put a comma links to. So when we do that, save it, we go over here, we go to console, and I will zoom up, and you will see the first one is the actual, the first one is the GSAP utils, and it's just a standard array, all right? In arrays, I have a lot more methods and abilities to work with compared to a node list. So when you use query selector all, it's like an array, but it's not as easy to work with and to iterate over and make changes to, essentially. So more often than not, just use GSAP utils to array and it will make it a true array. Okay, that's the first step. So let's go ahead and delete those two lines. The next step is we want to take all the links that it finds that we want to apply some type of interaction or animation to, and we want to iterate over each one of those. So we use the for each method to do that. So what we say is links.forEach link. All right. Now, by the way, if this type of JavaScript is kind of confusing to you, again, I can't iterate this enough. Make sure you watch the free JavaScript course here at DesignCourse.com so that you can work with this stuff from the very ground level. So what this is going to do now is it's going to basically provide us with each of the links that it finds. In this case, there's 4 A elements. All right. And what we want to do inside of there is we want to define a GreenSock timeline inside of here for each one. You don't want to create a GreenSock timeline outside of the for each statement. The reason you don't want to do that is because it will share, all 4 of those links will share the same timeline, and when you hover over one link, then it's going to animate all the other ones as well, kind of like in a stagger animation. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is define it here. And in fact, I'll show you what the difference is. So let's just create a link out here. Link, or we're going to say let rather, link TL, like link timeline, equals gsap.timeline. And I will give it some defaults. So we're going to say defaults, open that up. We're going to say ease is going to be power for out. I liked it for this one. No, in out, sorry. Hopefully you could see my code right here. Looks like I'm a little bit behind it. There we go. And then we are also going to specify a duration of 0.6. All right, so now we've created a timeline for each of the 4 links that it finds. All right, after that, we're going to create some basically properties or variables that are tied to specific elements that are found within each link. So here's how you do that. This is something we haven't covered either. We're going to say const heading start. Heading start is going to be the element that says primary. So one thing I didn't cover is, so heading container is the overflow hidden element. And then we have the first piece of type. Oops, I put span at the end of those. These are originally span elements, but I forgot to change the closing tag because I decided to use paragraph instead. That was dumb of me. Okay. There we go. That's much better. And so primary is the one that shows up by default without hovering, and then secondary is the one that will push up and reveal itself after hover. Okay, so we're just creating references to each one of those. Now the way we do this is we don't do document.querySelect. We do not do document. We do link, which is found here. That means it's going to find within each link the query selector that we want to find. So in this case, it's primary. So that's the start. We're going to replicate this a few times. So Shift-Alt down. Heading end is going to be the second one. So that's secondary. And again, these classes are right here, primary and secondary on each one. We also have a date. So the date right here is paragraph class date. And then also finally, we have like a line dash that shows up to the left. And that happens to be div class line. All right, so we say line. So again, nothing special happens yet. We've only defined properties right here, or variables that don't do anything essentially. So at this point is where we can go ahead and start creating the animation. So link timeline, we're going to say, let's just hit enter. And then go ahead and you can tab in if you wish. And then we're going to say to heading start, y% negative 100. Now let's just see if any of this works by default. And look how it's automatically playing like that. We don't want that. So we have to hit down here, link tl.pause. So now when this happens, here, let me close some of this out. Nothing's going to happen because we haven't added an event listener just yet. We've only iterated for each over each one of them. There's no event listeners defined yet. So what we do is we say link.add event listener. And again, link comes from up here. And we're going to say mouse enter. And then we say link timeline.play. Now we should see an animation. See that? Whoop, whoop, whoop. And it just goes by. It's very fun. Now, of course, inversely, we take this, we say mouse leave, and we say reverse. We've done this before. So now, and they're all going to come back. So the next step would be to chain another to method on heading end. So let's just copy that. Heading end. Y% is going to be this time 50. Get it in the middle. Oh no, oh no. All right, it's working. It's just really slow because we haven't added a time offset in the third parameter of the argument. So basically what we say right here is if we want it to start at the same time, we use the less than sign. So let's save that. Let's go back and look at that. It's so nice. I just really, it's so cool. Okay. Next up, we're going to go back to our CSS real quick, and you'll notice that I did add 2 comments to uncomment transform property. So if I remove both of those on the line, which to the left, which is taking to transform to scale x0, so we won't see it anymore. Transform origin, of course, is on the left because we want it to start to grow from the left and then to the right. And then the date, we're taking to translate y and putting 170%. You're probably wondering why not 100%? Well, because I tried that initially and it wasn't completely off the screen, unfortunately. So I had to adjust this value to where it was 100% off and out of view, essentially. I can actually show you. I'll just make it 100% and you'll see that it's still visible in the screen. So we need to bump that to right around 170%, and they're gone now. So is that line to the left. Now with that set in CSS as the default state, we can then just say we're going to take our line dash, because remember this is defined right here in line dash query selector class line, scale x1, and we're also going to make that start at the same exact time as well. So all 3 of these all start and animate at the same time like that. So now we can see to the left that line is growing. Then that leaves the only other thing, which is the date over here. So for the date, we say to date y0, And I want all these to start at the same time, so we're just going to save that. And look at that. Now, just to show you before what I was talking about when it comes to where you define your timeline is very important. Let me show you what happens. If we defined this timeline outside of the for each statement, like up here, and saved it, watch what happens. All of them start to animate, and that's not what we want. So that's a very crucial lesson that can confuse and throw you off, and you may not be certain why the timeline isn't working how you want it to. Where you define it is very important, as we've seen. So once again, this is the final solution, and I think it's a very, very cool sort of interaction.
All right, hopefully you enjoyed that. That's just a taste of the advanced front ends course. The whole course is 8.5 hours long. You can take that now at DesignCourse.com, and I'll see you really soon. Goodbye.